There is a silence in history that is often louder than the words that have survived. A silence that drapes itself like a veil across entire civilizations, muting subjects that were once spoken of freely, and leaving us with fragments that whisper of lives and desires never fully recorded. Egypt, land of pharaohs and gods, pyramids and temples, is one such place where this silence is palpable. Beneath the grandeur of stone, beneath the monuments meant to last for eternity, lies a current of human experience that was carefully obscured, purposefully softened, or perhaps deliberately erased. The erotic life of ancient Egypt, the pleasures and passions of kings and queens, the sacred rites of fertility, the whispers of seduction immortalized in murals and papyri, remains a subject so elusive that even scholars tread carefully around its shadow. Tonight, we will enter that shadow, not to expose in vulgarity, but to drift through the currents of time in search of what history tried to bury. In doing so, we will wander into the unsettling spaces where desire and divinity met, where love was ritual and pleasure was political, where secrecy itself was power. To walk into this story is to walk slowly, almost reverently, into the chambers of a forgotten temple. Imagine the air cool, the torches dim, the fragrance of lotus and incense lingering on the stone. You move deeper inside, and the walls close around you, carved with images that seem at first ordinary, scenes of offerings, God seated in judgment, symbols of life and death. Yet, as your eyes adjust, the shapes begin to shift. Some images are subtler, their meanings concealed beneath the language of symbols. A curve of a body, a gesture of the hand, an embrace that is more than ceremonial. This is the way the Egyptians often spoke of desire, not openly, but in riddles, in metaphors, in signs woven so seamlessly into their spiritual landscape that only the attentive could discern their double meanings. And so we begin our descent, not just into a civilization, but into the mystery of why so much of this side of life was hidden, why later chroniclers erased it, and why the erotic secrets of the pharaohs remain among the most shadowed of all antiquity. The erotic in Egypt was not merely physical, it was cosmic. To understand how sexuality wove itself into the very fabric of their world, one must first remember that to the Egyptians, creation itself was born from an act of divine intimacy. In one version of their myths, Adam, the self-created God, brought the world into being through an act of solitary pleasure, spilling his seed to form the first elements of existence. In another, the sky goddess Nut and the earth god Geb were lovers whose embrace had to be pried apart by the god Shu, their separation giving birth to the visible heavens and the fertile ground below. Desire, therefore, was not shameful, it was Genesis, it was power, it was the movement of eternity itself. Yet, what feels strange to us now is how this divine sexuality translated into human practice, how pharaohs embodied these myths, and how rituals often blurred the line between sacred devotion and bodily pleasure. Over time, as empires fell and new religions rose, what had once been sacred became scandalous, and what had once been recorded became erased. This tension between remembrance and forgetting is what makes the story so haunting, and it is where we must linger. Close your eyes, if you wish, and imagine drifting upon the Nile at dusk. The water is still, the reeds sway, the air is cool and heavy with the scent of wet earth. Along the banks, shadows of temples loom, and one can almost hear the faint music of flutes carried from distant rituals. In these moments, the erotic was everywhere, not as something hidden behind closed doors, but as a pulse within the natural world. Fertility of the soil, the swelling of the river, the blossoming of the lotus, all spoke to the Egyptians of cycles of passion and renewal. To them, the body mirrored the earth, and the pleasure of union mirrored the turning of seasons. Yet in spite of this cosmic acceptance, there is also evidence of concealment, as if the pharaohs and priests knew too well that power was bound up with secrecy. To control desire was to control creation itself, and so the erotic became a guarded language, one that only initiates could fully understand. When we turn the pages of Egyptian literature, we find whispers that feel almost too intimate for texts preserved across millennia. There are fragments of love poetry, carved on ostraca or written on papyri, that speak of yearning glances, stolen moments, and the intoxication of touch. The lovers describe the sweetness of beer on the lips of the beloved, the fragrance of her hair, the trembling joy of lying close beneath the moonlight. These words, drifting across time, remind us that behind the masks of kings and queens, behind the rigid postures of statues, there were hearts that longed, bodies that ached, and desires that surged with life. And yet, what is strange is how such poetry coexists with silence in the royal record. Pharaohs spoke endlessly of battles, of monuments, of their devotion to gods, but rarely of their pleasures. When erotic imagery appears, it is often veiled, encoded in symbolism, tucked into the margins of rituals, or buried with the dead. The question, then, is not only why these things existed, but why they were hidden. Part of the answer lies in power. For the pharaoh, eroticism was not simply private indulgence, it was political theater. His virility was the health of the land, his potency the guarantee of crops and continuity. Ceremonies may have required him to demonstrate this potency, sometimes in ritualized ways that modern audiences would find unsettling, even scandalous. There are hints in Greek accounts, in stray Egyptian inscriptions, and in the shadowy traces of temple practice, that fertility rites may have involved acts both symbolic and real. The pharaoh, embodying Horus or Osiris, uniting with a goddess represented by a priestess or queen, could reenact the very cycle of creation upon which all life depended. To reveal too much of this would be to expose the fragile thread upon which legitimacy hung. And so secrecy became survival, ritual cloaked in mystery, desire clothed in divinity. Yet, as we will see, this secrecy was not absolute. On the walls of certain tombs, erotic imagery lingers, softened perhaps by time but still visible. On scraps of papyrus, medical texts detail fertility practices with startling frankness. In hidden caches, erotic figurines have been found, their meanings debated by scholars. Some dismiss them as charms, others see them as representations of sacred unions, while still others suspect they may have served as instruments of instruction in the arts of pleasure. Whatever their true purpose, they remind us that the Egyptians did not separate the erotic from the sacred as harshly as later cultures did. For them, the two flowed together like the Nile and its banks, inseparable and eternal. It is this blending that unsettles us now. We, the inheritors of a history written largely by societies that feared or repressed desire, find it difficult to accept that one of the greatest civilizations on earth could treat sexuality with reverence rather than shame. Thus, the erasures of later historians, the Greeks who laughed at Egyptian practices, the Romans who caricatured them, the Christian chroniclers who denounced them, the modern archaeologists who quietly tucked away objects too scandalous to display, all contributed to a silence that echoes louder than the truths themselves. What we are left with are fragments, and from these fragments we must reconstruct a picture that is less about salacious detail and more about understanding how erotic power shaped the lives of pharaohs and the destiny of their kingdom. The unsettling undertone of this journey lies in how much we do not know. The very absence becomes haunting. What rites took place in the innermost chambers of Karnak and Luxor, far from the eyes of common people? What whispers passed between queen and priestess, between pharaoh and consort, when their roles were not merely human but divine? What ceremonies may have involved the mingling of flesh and spirit, staged beneath the watchful eyes of gods sculpted in stone? We may never know fully, but the hints are enough to disturb the stillness of history. They invite us into a narrative that feels both intimate and forbidden, both sacred and profane. So as you drift further into this story, let yourself feel the strangeness of entering a silence that was not meant to be broken. Imagine yourself seated in a boat, gliding deeper into the Nile at night. The stars burn above, mirrored in the dark water. Along the horizon, the outline of pyramids rises like shadows of eternity. The air grows heavier, the rhythm of the oars slower. You are being carried, slowly, into a history that resists being spoken, into a chamber of memory where desire, secrecy, and power intertwine. This is not a journey of scandal, nor of spectacle. It is a meditation on what it means that even the most powerful rulers in history, those who built monuments to last forever, still felt compelled to conceal their pleasures. And perhaps, in that concealment, lies the greatest mystery of all. The silence of the erotic in Egypt is not the silence of absence. It is a silence alive with echoes, a silence that hums with things deliberately unspoken, carefully veiled. When we lean into that silence, it begins to pulse with life, as though the stones themselves carry memories that words no longer hold. It is in this space, half forgotten and half concealed, that the story of the Pharaohs' secrets unfolds. For even as scribes withheld explicit detail, and even as priests cloaked rites in layers of symbolism, the human impulse to remember never completely disappeared. It lingers in the cracks of murals, in the rhythms of love poems, in the laughter of festival songs, and in the fragments of objects too intimate for public display. To trace these remnants is to trace a current of passion running beneath the polished surface of official history, a current that reveals as much in its concealment as it does in its expression. Imagine now the festivals of Egypt, when ordinary life bent under the weight of ritual and ecstasy. The most famous of these was the festival of Opet, when statues of the gods were carried in procession from Karnak to Luxor, their passage accompanied by music, dance, and offerings. While the crowds cheered, deeper mysteries unfolded behind the temple walls, mysteries that may have included sacred unions reenacting the bonds of deities. Herodotus, centuries later, would write of festivals in which the boundaries of propriety were loosened, where drunkenness and revelry disguised older, stranger practices. He described laughter, song, and gestures that shocked the sensibilities of his Greek readers, yet to the Egyptians these were echoes of cosmic joy. The erotic here was not shameful, but celebratory, a release of vitality in harmony with divine cycles. Still, what was written down by outsiders was colored with mockery and misunderstanding, and the Egyptians themselves left little record of what truly transpired within the sanctuaries. Thus, history offers us only silhouettes of these festivals, shadows cast by fires whose true flames are long extinguished. The most unsettling mysteries are those linked with the pharaoh himself. Consider, for example, the sacred marriage rites that scholars believe may have taken place during coronation ceremonies. The king, as Horus, may have ritually united with the goddess Hathor, embodied by his queen or a high priestess. This act, veiled in metaphor and cloaked in secrecy, was more than symbolic. It was believed to renew the fertility of the land and guarantee the prosperity of the kingdom. Some ancient sources hint at rites where the pharaoh's seed was offered to the Nile, mingling human and cosmic potency in a gesture of unity with creation. To us, this feels strange, even unnerving, but to the Egyptians it was a reminder that their ruler was not merely mortal, but a vessel of divine force. What is remarkable is how carefully such details were hidden from public texts. The stones proclaim victories in battle and gifts to the gods, but on these matters they remain silent, as though revealing them would weaken their power. In secrecy lay sanctity, and in sanctity, control. There are, however, fragments that betray this silence. In the Turin erotic papyrus, often called the first pornographic work in history, we glimpse a startling vision of Egyptian erotic imagination. The papyrus, discovered in fragments, depicts men and women in explicit poses, their bodies exaggerated, their acts unabashed. Alongside these images are satirical sketches mocking priests, animals, and scenes of daily life. Some scholars dismiss it as crude entertainment, others argue it may have served ritual or instructional purposes. What unsettles us most is that such a document could exist in a culture so often imagined as austere and solemn. Yet here it is, a reminder that behind the hieroglyphs of eternity lay flesh and laughter, desire and jest. Was this papyrus a secret possession, meant only for the eyes of initiates? Or was it part of a broader acceptance of erotic expression now lost to us? Its very survival suggests that what we imagine as taboo may not have been taboo at all, but rather integral to a worldview where sexuality was both divine and human, sacred and profane. Even the gods themselves remind us of this duality. Consider Osiris, dismembered by his brother Set, his body scattered across the land. Isis, his devoted wife, reassembled him, yet could not find his phallus, which had been devoured by a fish. In its place, she fashioned one of gold, and through their union, Horus was conceived. This myth, central to Egyptian religion, is unashamed in its erotic symbolism. It speaks of loss and renewal, of sacred sexuality as the force that conquers death itself. In this myth, the pharaoh is the living Horus, the heir born of divine union, and his legitimacy is tied directly to the erotic power of gods. How strange it seems, then, that later ages would erase or sanitize these stories, muting their sensual elements in favor of more palatable moralities. The Egyptians, however, saw no contradiction. To them, erotic creation was life, and life was divine. And yet, the silence persists, growing heavier the closer we come to the pharaohs themselves. We know of their queens, some renowned for beauty and influence, Nefertiti, with her serene gaze immortalized in sculpture, Cleopatra, whose allure bent empires to her will, but the intimate details of their lives remain shadows. What did their nights hold? What whispered words passed in the secrecy of chambers built to mimic eternity? The evidence is scattered, amulets shaped like fertility symbols, fragments of love poetry attributed to queens, inscriptions that praise a king's virility as though it were a matter of state. All suggest a world where passion and politics were deeply intertwined. To reveal too much, however, would strip the divine mask from the ruler, leaving him exposed as a man of flesh and desire. Thus, history concealed him, preserving instead the image of eternal power. Why did later ages try so hard to bury these truths? Partly because they were incomprehensible. To the Greeks, whose philosophers often prized rationality over mystery, Egyptian erotic rituals seemed excessive, laughable, or grotesque. To the Romans, who both indulged in and censured sensuality, Egyptian practices became material for caricature, tales of decadence spun to justify conquest. To the early Christians, who sought to distance themselves from pagan sensuality, Egyptian erotic symbolism was an abomination, a relic of idolatry that needed erasure. And so the silence deepened, not born of Egypt itself, but of the judgments imposed upon it. In museums, even today, erotic figurines and papyri often rest in hidden drawers, labeled discreetly, rarely displayed. The shadows remain, curated as carefully as they once were by priests in sanctuaries. This is the haunting undertone of our journey, that what we know of Egypt is as much shaped by forgetting as by remembering. To wander through its ruins is to feel the weight of things unsaid pressing in from every side. The pyramids stand as monuments to eternity, yet within them there are voids, passages that lead nowhere, chambers that remain sealed. Perhaps the greatest of these voids is not architectural, but cultural, the silence around the erotic life of those who built them. And so, as we drift through this narrative, we are not seeking scandal, nor titillation. We are seeking to understand why secrecy itself was so powerful, and why, across centuries, so many voices conspired to keep these stories hidden. Picture again the Nile at night. The river flows endlessly, a ribbon of darkness shimmering with starlight. The temples rise like shadows against the horizon, their colossal columns etched with scenes of gods whose gestures conceal more than they reveal. Somewhere in the stillness, you hear faint music, a rhythm of drums, a melody of flutes. It is as though the stones themselves are remembering. They whisper of rites where bodies and divinities met, where pharaohs embodied gods in acts both cosmic and carnal, where secrecy preserved sanctity, and where desire was not shameful but eternal. You cannot see these rites, for they are long gone, but you can feel their echoes in the air, a trembling that unsettles even as it soothes. This, then, is where our journey begins. In the silence of history, in the spaces between words, in the shadows that cling to stone. We will walk with the pharaohs not only through their wars and monuments, but through their secret chambers, their hidden rituals, their unspoken desires. We will listen to the echoes of poetry, to the whispers of myths, to the laughter preserved in forbidden papyri. And as we move deeper, we will ask why these truths were hidden, why history turned away, and what it means that even eternity itself carries shadows. So let your mind drift, slowly, like the Nile itself. Feel the cool air of the desert night, the weight of the stars above, the hush of temples in the distance. You are entering a story that is both intimate and vast, unsettling yet strangely soothing, a meditation on secrets that refuse to die. The erotic secrets of the pharaohs are not merely curiosities of the past. They are reflections of humanity's oldest paradox, that what is most sacred is often what is most hidden, and that what is hidden has a way of lingering, haunting, and calling us back across the ages. Here, in this silence, our journey begins. To speak of the pharaoh is to speak of a body that was never wholly his own. The king's flesh, his breath, his desires, and his potency were believed to belong not merely to himself but to the cosmos, to Egypt, to the gods who wove their essence through him. The pharaoh was not simply ruler, he was Horus incarnate, the son of Ra, the heir of Osiris, a man whose life was bound to the divine in ways that blurred the distinction between mortal and immortal. To touch him was to touch divinity, to desire him was to desire the gods, and to speak of his body was to speak of the body of Egypt itself. Yet, even as this belief elevated him beyond the realm of ordinary men, it also wrapped him in layers of secrecy. The pharaoh's body could be revered, displayed, carved in stone upon temple walls, yet its most intimate truths were hidden, cloaked, spoken of only in whispers or preserved in rituals performed in shadowed chambers. It is this duality that draws us deeper. For the Egyptians, the body was not shameful, but a microcosm of the universe. Every limb, every organ, every impulse reflected something of the greater whole. The heart was the seat of emotion and thought, the lungs the breath of life, the seed of man the spark of eternity. To neglect the body was to neglect the divine, to honor it was to honor creation itself. This is why Egyptian art, though stylized and formal, often conveys a sense of vitality, of bodies that are not merely symbolic but deeply alive. And yet, for all this reverence, the body of the pharaoh in particular was carefully guarded. His sexuality, his passions, his desires, all were forces too powerful to be left unrecorded, yet too dangerous to be described openly. They remained encoded in myth, symbolized in ritual, hidden beneath metaphors that concealed as much as they revealed. We begin with the coronation, the moment when a man became king, when flesh was transformed into divinity. Accounts suggest that this was no simple political ceremony, but a ritual suffused with symbolism of union and renewal. Some scholars believe that the new pharaoh may have been expected to demonstrate his potency, either through symbolic gestures or through actual acts tied to fertility rites. In this, he embodied Osiris, the god whose dismemberment and resurrection symbolized the cycle of death and rebirth, and also Horus, the son who avenged his father and brought order from chaos. The king's virility was not private, it was the heartbeat of Egypt. If he was strong, the Nile would flood, the crops would flourish, the people would prosper. If he faltered, chaos would creep in, and the fragile balance of Ma'at, the order of the universe, would collapse. This is why, in the shadows of coronation, the erotic played a role, for it was through the body that life and order were renewed. One cannot help but feel the unsettling undertone of these moments. Imagine the tension of standing in the darkened sanctuaries, torches flickering against walls carved with gods who watched silently. The priests chant hymns, the drums echo, the air thick with incense. In the center, the pharaoh, no longer merely a man but the vessel of Horus, enacts rites whose details are lost to us. Did he unite with a priestess embodying Hathor, goddess of love and fertility? Did he spill his seed upon the earth or into the waters as an offering to the Nile? Was the act literal, or symbolic, or some strange interweaving of both? We cannot know for certain. The records are silent, and the silence itself is haunting. Yet the hints that remain suggest that the pharaoh's flesh was not hidden away but placed at the very heart of cosmic renewal, his desire transformed into ritual, his body into a temple of divinity. This blending of the sacred and the erotic was not limited to coronation. Throughout his reign, the pharaoh's virility was celebrated as proof of divine favor. In hymns and inscriptions, his body was described in language that fused power and sensuality. He was strong as a bull, potent as the sun, fertile as the Nile. His queen, too, was more than a companion, she was the embodiment of goddesses, sometimes Isis, sometimes Hathor, sometimes the Great Mother Mut. Their union was no mere marriage but a reenactment of cosmic love, a binding of flesh and eternity. And yet, we must ask, how much of this was metaphor, and how much was reality? The line is blurred, and in that blur lies the mystery that history has tried to obscure. Fragments of erotic imagery appear in tombs and temples, though often softened by symbolism. A lotus flower held delicately by a hand might suggest sensual awakening, a pair of geese, nestled close, might symbolize intimacy. In one tomb painting, a couple reclines together, their bodies close, their gazes tender, a rare glimpse of affection in art so often formal. These images, subtle yet undeniable, remind us that behind the divine masks of the pharaohs were men and women who longed, touched, desired. The official silence may have hidden their secrets, but the art betrays them, whispering across millennia of passions that refuse to be erased. Consider also the fertility festivals, particularly those associated with Min, the god of virility. His statues, unmistakable in their exaggerated symbolism, were carried in procession, and offerings were made to ensure the potency of both land and people. The pharaoh, as intermediary between gods and humans, was often expected to participate in such rituals, his presence affirming the vitality of Egypt itself. There are accounts of ceremonies where women sang songs laced with erotic imagery, where laughter and desire mingled with prayer, where the line between sacred celebration and sensual expression dissolved. These festivals, far from being hidden, were part of the public rhythm of life, yet their deeper meanings were reserved for initiates, cloaked in secrecy even as they unfolded in plain sight. The pharaoh's body was also guarded in death, preserved with a care that speaks to the sanctity of flesh. Mummification was not merely preservation, it was transformation, the crafting of a body fit for eternity. Organs were removed, treated, returned, the skin was anointed with oils, the body wrapped in layers of linen. Amulets were placed at vital points, many of them explicitly linked to fertility and sexuality. The phallus, in particular, was preserved or even reconstructed, for without it the king could not hope to be reborn in the afterlife. In the tomb of Tutankhamun, some scholars noted peculiarities that suggested deliberate emphasis on his virility, though the interpretations remain contested. What is certain is that the erotic was not discarded at death, it was enshrined, immortalized, deemed essential for rebirth. In eternity, as in life, desire was divine. And yet, for all this evidence, we still encounter great silence. Why do the records not speak more openly? Why do we not have detailed accounts of the pharaoh's unions, their passions, their rites? Perhaps it is because secrecy itself was power. To reveal too much would strip the mysteries of their potency. The erotic, bound to creation, was too sacred to be spoken of casually, too dangerous to be entrusted to common knowledge. Only the initiated priests, only the royal household, only those within the inner sanctuaries were allowed to witness or to know. What remains for us are shadows, symbols, fragments. The silence is deliberate, and it is this deliberate silence that unsettles us most of all. When we walk today through the ruins of Karnak, through the columns that rise like stone forests into the sky, we are overwhelmed by the grandeur of what remains. Yet, beneath that grandeur, there is a lingering sense of absence. What we see is power carved in stone, but what we do not see, what was once whispered in the shadows, is the flesh beneath, the passions that sustained it. The erotic secrets of the pharaohs were not merely indulgences, they were woven into the very structure of Egypt's belief. Their concealment is not a denial of their existence, but an acknowledgement of their potency. To hide something so carefully is to admit that it holds immense power. So, as we step deeper, let us carry this image, the pharaoh, standing in the dim light of the sanctuary, his body both mortal and divine, his flesh both personal and cosmic. Around him, priests chant, symbols shimmer, the air is heavy with incense. What unfolds here we cannot know in detail, yet we can feel its weight in the silence that has survived. This is the body of the pharaoh, hidden, exalted, desired, concealed. A body that was a nation, a god, a mystery. A body whose secrets linger, waiting to be unearthed in whispers, symbols, and fragments across the endless desert of time. As the Nile's waters continued to pulse through the land like the blood of a living being, the pharaoh's architects of desire carved more than stone. They carved ritual itself into permanence. The walls of temples bore not only the names of gods but also the coded gestures of intimacy, symbols of the generative forces that the gods themselves embodied. To the untrained eye, such marks might appear as mere decorations, flourishes of an ancient aesthetic. Yet to the priests and initiates, these carvings were maps to hidden truths about fertility, passion, and the convergence of human yearning with divine command. In the hushed darkness of the sanctuaries, light touching the symbols in the quiet hours before dawn, the faithful would come to believe that the gods did not simply create life but desired life, hungered for it, reached out in the most human of ways to touch it into being. Whispers from the papyri reveal fragments of such teachings, though often cloaked in allegory. To speak too plainly would risk the wrath of later dynasties, whose obsession with legacy sometimes required the erasure of dangerous knowledge. Yet the fragments endure, mentions of Hathor's drunken revelry where love was made holy, of Min's phallus as tall as a column, of Isis's unrelenting search for Osiris's body, gathering the pieces with a devotion that blurred the line between grief and longing. These stories were not just myths, they were codes, illustrations of how divine union was not only possible but essential. The power of the Pharaoh, as living god, was in part derived from this fusion. He was the fertile force incarnate, the axis upon which heaven and earth met in desire. The rituals themselves, though cloaked in secrecy, can be glimpsed through records left behind. There are traces of ceremonies where sacred statues were bathed and adorned, where offerings of oils, perfumes, and intoxicating wine were laid before them, and where priests and priestesses embodied the roles of gods in ecstatic union. The Egyptians did not fear the physical expression of longing, they wove it into the fabric of their religious devotion. To them, desire was not a corruption but an echo of the creative energy that had once summoned the world from chaos. To deny it was to deny the first principle of existence itself. But here lies the unsettling undertone, the shadow trailing behind the luminous facade of sacred love. For not all unions were consensual in the way we might imagine. The Pharaoh, absolute and divine, held in his hands the right to claim bodies as he claimed land and water. Royal women were often pawns, offered as vessels for dynastic continuity. Ritual unions, while exalted, could be coercive beneath the gilded language of cosmic balance. Inscriptions that once seemed celebratory now shimmer with unease when read against the silence of those who could not choose. Here history's attempt to veil itself becomes clear. The erotic secrets were not always sweet. They were also instruments of control, mechanisms by which flesh became empire. Among the most haunting accounts is the story of Cleopatra before she was the last of her line, when the echoes of earlier queens, Ahmose Nefertari, Hatshepsut, Nefertiti, still lingered in the collective memory. These women wielded erotic power as political currency, not simply through seduction but through their ability to embody goddesses. In ritual, a queen might be Hathor incarnate, joining with the pharaoh to sustain the cycles of the cosmos. Yet, beyond the temple, such unions often forged alliances, manipulated rivals, or subdued dissent. Sex was theater, religion, and politics fused into one relentless performance under the watchful gaze of the gods. One can imagine the temple courtyards at night, lit by braziers that flickered against sandstone walls carved with hieroglyphs. The air heavy with incense, the hum of chants rising like a low tide, the sound of drums syncing with the rhythm of breath and heartbeat. Within the inner sanctum, hidden from the common worshippers, bodies may have moved in deliberate choreography, their gestures mimicking cosmic creation, their flesh transformed into symbols of sky and earth, sun and moon, seed and soil. And though we cannot know the full truth, the fragments that survive suggest that these moments were both ecstatic and solemn, both deeply human and profoundly otherworldly. Yet, for all the grandeur, the truth also dripped into the soil of daily life. Erotic amulets depicting male and female forms were carried by ordinary Egyptians as charms of fertility. Graffiti in workmen's villages mocked or celebrated carnal union with surprising candor, scribbled in places never meant for posterity. Everyday people, in their laughter and longing, mirrored the sanctified rituals of the elite. The sacred and the profane dissolved into one another until desire became a language spoken at all levels of society. This was the erotic cosmos of Egypt, one vast continuum in which no boundary existed between heaven and bedchamber. But centuries later, as new conquerors arrived, first the Persians, then the Greeks, then the Romans, the tolerance for these mysteries waned. Greek chroniclers, embarrassed by what they saw as Egyptian excess, wrote with disdain. They cloaked Egyptian sacred sexuality in ridicule, transforming rituals into scandal, myths into obscenities. Later Roman authors followed, layering their disdain with satire, eager to portray Egypt as both exotic and degenerate. And with the arrival of Christianity, the final veils were drawn. Desire was no longer divine, it was sin. The carvings were defaced, the papyri burned, the gods declared demons, and what had once been sacred became obscene. History itself tried to bury these truths beneath centuries of silence. The ruins of temples along the Nile still carry scars of this erasure. Chiseled faces of men, once brazenly erect, now worn away by zealous hands. Reliefs of Hathor's fertility masked beneath gouged stone. Manuscripts mentioning ritual ecstasy deliberately mistranslated or omitted by scribes who sought to align Egypt's memory with the new moral codes. Yet the earth does not forget. Buried beneath the desert sands, preserved in tombs where papyrus resisted decay, fragments whisper still of what was once believed, that the pharaohs were not merely rulers, not merely warriors or builders of pyramids, but guardians of an erotic knowledge so powerful that later centuries sought desperately to suppress it. And so we arrive at the threshold of this hidden world, with only fragments to guide us, fragments that shimmer like broken mirrors in the dim corridors of history. What was the true nature of these secrets? Were they sacred revelations of cosmic unity, or were they tools of manipulation dressed in divine garments? The truth likely lies in both, suspended in the uneasy space between awe and exploitation. This duality is what makes the erotic secrets of the pharaohs both mesmerizing and disturbing, both beautiful and haunting. History often seeks to smooth its surface, to erase contradictions, to cleanse the untidy realities that disturb the narrative of glory. But beneath the polished veneer of pharaohs enthroned, of monuments rising, of armies conquering, there is this undercurrent, erotic, sacred, forbidden. And it is here, in the currents that ripple beneath the surface, that the true story of Egypt's intimacy with desire resides. The Nile carries its echoes still, a river that remembers what people tried to forget. Thus, with certainty but with an invitation, to descend further into the labyrinth of secrecy, where myth and body, temple and bed, devotion and desire intertwine. The erotic secrets of the pharaohs remain hidden, not because they are unknowable, but because history itself trembles before their power. To uncover them is to confront not only Egypt's mysteries but also our own unease with the sacredness of flesh. The air in Egypt was thick with paradox. The land itself was a paradox, both generous and merciless, the desert pressing against the narrow ribbon of the Nile with all the menace of an eternal silence, and yet within that narrow ribbon, life exploded in abundance. Such contrasts shaped not only the material life of the pharaohs but their spiritual imaginations. To live in Egypt was to feel the constant tension between fertility and barrenness, between the flowing river and the sterile sands, between the nourishing flood and the deadly drought. Out of this landscape arose the belief that sexuality, desire, and fertility were not incidental but central, woven into the fabric of the cosmos itself. And so, in the heart of their civilization, they crafted sacred practices that were both erotic and divine, rituals that blurred the line between worship and intimacy, between myth and flesh. The myth of creation that most Egyptians knew began with a solitary god, Adam, who stood alone in the endless waters of none. There was nothing else, no earth, no sky, no other beings. And from his own body, in acts described both poetically and explicitly, Adam brought forth the first divine pair, Shu and Tefnut. Some hymns speak of him spitting or sneezing them into existence, but others, less veiled, more daring, tell of him pleasuring himself into creation, his seed becoming the building block of gods, sky, and earth. This was not a shameful act in the Egyptian imagination. It was the holiest of acts, self-sufficiency turned into cosmic genesis. Adam's body was the temple, his longing the spark, his climax the Big Bang of antiquity. From this myth flowed the conviction that sexual acts, whether solitary, paired, or ritualized within the temple, were not merely human indulgences but echoes of divine power. The pharaoh, as Adam's earthly counterpart, could embody creation through similar acts. In times of crisis, when the Nile failed to flood or famine threatened the land, priests and kings would turn to rituals that invoked this primal force. There are records, fragmentary but suggestive, of ceremonies where the pharaoh, standing on temple steps, would release seed into the sacred waters, offering his body as a vessel of divine renewal. The waters of the Nile, already regarded as the lifeblood of Egypt, became doubly sacred, carrying not only the floods that sustained crops but also the pharaoh's symbolic fertility, a mingling of God, man, and river. It is difficult to read such accounts without a sense of both awe and unease. Awe at the raw honesty of a civilization that did not recoil from linking sex and sacredness, and unease at the strangeness of such imagery in a world where later traditions taught that holiness and carnality must be kept apart. For the Egyptians, no such division existed. Desire was divine, seed was sacred, the body was temple. Yet the very power of these beliefs made them fragile, vulnerable to distortion by those who came after. One must imagine the rituals as layered performances, designed not only for the gods but for the people who watched, for the priests who recorded, and for the court that guarded its authority. Imagine the hushed crowd, gathered beyond the sanctum, hearing the chants that echoed against stone. Imagine the sound of sistrums, their metallic shaking imitating the trembling of ecstasy, rattling the night air with hints of divine presence. Within, perhaps, the pharaoh stood before the cult statue of Osiris or Ammonius, accompanied by priestesses dressed as goddesses, their movements choreographed, their bodies painted with ochre and scented with myrrh. The act, whether symbolic or enacted in flesh, was more than ritual, it was theater, myth retold not in words but in skin and breath. And yet, behind the magnificence, there was control. The erotic rituals were not available to all, they belonged to the elite, to those sanctioned by proximity to the pharaoh and the gods. What was preached as cosmic renewal often doubled as an instrument of hierarchy. The pharaoh's seed was divine, but the seed of common men was ordinary, expendable. The pharaoh's unions were sacred, while those of peasants were often ignored or dismissed. Thus, within this framework, sexuality became stratified, as political as it was religious. Bodies became instruments of power, women's roles circumscribed within the needs of dynastic succession, men's vigor valued only when it served the harvest or the army. It is here that the erotic secrets of the pharaohs reveal their darker edges. Consider the story of Osiris and Isis, Osiris dismembered by Set, Isis scouring the land to find his scattered pieces, reassembling him body by body, until she could breathe life into him once more. Yet one piece, the myth insists, was missing, the phallus, devoured by a fish in the Nile. Undeterred, Isis crafted a replacement and, through her magic, joined with Osiris, conceiving Horus. This myth, repeated endlessly in temple reliefs and funerary texts, became a metaphor for resilience and continuity. But it also encoded the message that sexuality was indispensable, that without union, even forced union, even fabricated union, life could not go on. The story's surface shimmered with devotion, but beneath it lay the insinuation that longing, grief, and necessity could blur into coercion and manipulation. Even in their sacred festivals, such as those dedicated to Hathor, the goddess of love, music, and intoxication, the erotic played a central role. Hymns speak of her being aroused by the music of sistrums, by the laughter of the gods, by the intoxication of wine flowing endlessly. Celebrants drank deeply, danced wildly, and surrendered themselves to frenzy, convinced that in these moments of abandonment they touched the divine. The line between joy and danger was razor-thin. For in the ecstasy of the crowd, where inhibitions dissolved, the boundaries of the self blurred. Desire became communal, overwhelming, at times violent. What was sacred could quickly tip into chaos, and what was ecstatic could shift into unsettling realms where bodies lost control. The pharaoh's own role in these festivals was carefully managed. He appeared at their height, often in resplendent attire, adorned in symbols of fertility, the bull's tail, the erect phallus carved discreetly into his regalia, the crown of Upper and Lower Egypt merging like male and female in union. His presence reminded the people that desire was not only theirs but his, that the cosmos itself depended on his virility. And yet, in the very insistence on this spectacle, there is the faintest trace of anxiety. Why display virility so insistently if it were beyond question? Why dramatize the pharaoh's erotic power so often unless it was fragile, threatened, always in need of reinforcement? The rituals, for all their grandeur, betray a lurking fear, that power, even divine power, could falter, could fail to arouse the world into life. We see this fear inscribed in the cult of Min, the fertility god whose image, erect, towering, unabashed, still shocks modern viewers. To the Egyptians, Min's unabashed display was not obscene but essential. Priests anointed his statue with oil, offered lettuce as a symbol of potency, and celebrated his generative force in festivals that pushed the boundaries of propriety. But again, beneath the surface, lies something more complex. The cult of Min was tied not only to fertility of the fields but also to the pharaoh's legitimacy. The king himself participated in rituals honoring Min, presenting offerings as if to prove his own virility before gods and people alike. Failure in such rituals would have been unthinkable, and so the pressure to perform, whether literal or symbolic, must have weighed heavily on the monarch. Desire, in this context, was not private. It was national, cosmic, obligatory. As centuries rolled on, different dynasties reinterpreted these rituals, sometimes amplifying their erotic dimensions, sometimes concealing them. The Amarna period under Akhenaten, for instance, shifted focus toward a more austere monotheism centered on Aten, the sun disk. Yet even here, the king's erotic life was never far from view. Reliefs show Akhenaten and Nefertiti in tender, intimate poses, kissing, embracing, their children clambering about them. To later eyes, these images appear almost mundane, domestic. But in the context of Egyptian tradition, they were revolutionary, the royal couple portrayed not as distant icons but as lovers, partners, parents. The erotic here was softened, but no less significant. It became a display of divine union embodied in everyday tenderness, a reminder that love itself was sacred. Still, the shadows persisted. To be Pharaoh was to be both God and man, both symbol and body, both eternal and fragile. His erotic life could never simply be his own. It belonged to the state, the temple, the cosmos. And this is perhaps the most unsettling truth of all, that intimacy, which for most of us is private, hidden, personal, was for the pharaohs something staged, ritualized, controlled, consumed by the machinery of power. Their secrets were not only erotic but tragic, for even in their most vulnerable moments, they could not escape the gaze of history. And so, as we wander deeper into these mysteries, through temples scarred by time, through myths half-remembered and censored, through rituals glimpsed in fragments of papyrus, we come closer to the heart of Egypt's paradox. A culture that exalted desire as sacred, yet feared its power. A civilization that turned sex into ritual, yet chained it to politics. A history that celebrated fertility, yet silenced those whose bodies bore the weight of these cosmic performances. The erotic secrets of the pharaohs are therefore not only about pleasure but about fear, not only about life but about the fragility of power. They shimmer like the Nile at dusk, beautiful, haunting, and edged with shadows. The Nile at night was a mirror of obsidian, the moon drifting across it like a pale eye, half shut in dream. It is in these hours that one can imagine the priests moving silently through temple corridors, torches in hand, preparing for ceremonies that carried the weight of both desire and dread. These rituals, which modern readers might call erotic, were never mere indulgences. They were cosmological reenactments, sacred theater designed to ensure the survival of Egypt itself. Every touch, every gesture, every whispered invocation belonged not to the participants alone but to the gods above and the land below. Flesh became symbol, arousal became power, and climax was nothing less than creation renewed. Yet the closer we draw to these ceremonies, the more shadows gather. Accounts from later dynasties suggest that participation was not always voluntary. Priestesses chosen to embody Hathor or Isis, their bodies painted with oils, their limbs adorned with beads, may have been honored in theory but in practice constrained by the machinery of temple law. A woman who was declared to be Hathor incarnate could not refuse union with the pharaoh, for to refuse him was to refuse the gods themselves. Likewise, young men, initiated into the mysteries of Min, found their virility judged not by private moments of desire but by public performance, their potency a matter of national survival. What had been divine in myth risked becoming exploitation in ritual. The paradox deepens when we consider how carefully such practices were guarded, hidden from ordinary eyes. Much of the erotic life of the pharaoh was confined to the sanctum, away from the gaze of common people. This secrecy was not only about protecting the sacred from desecration, it was also about protecting power from scrutiny. For if the common Egyptian farmer had witnessed his king in the vulnerable, intimate posture of ritualized union, he might have questioned the distance between man and God. Better to veil such acts in mystery, to describe them in allegory, to carve them into stone with symbols that only priests could interpret. Thus, the erotic secrets of the pharaohs became not only hidden acts but hidden texts, their meanings shrouded in metaphor, their rawness softened by myth. One striking example lies in the myth of the heavenly cow, where humanity rebels against Ra, the sun god. To punish them, Ra sends Hathor, transformed into Sekhmet, a lion-headed goddess of fury, who begins slaughtering humanity with terrifying force. But Ra repents of his destruction and seeks to calm her rage. He orders that vast quantities of beer be dyed red and poured across the fields, so that it resembles blood. Sekhmet, lured by the sight, drinks deeply until she is intoxicated, her bloodlust transformed into laughter and lust. The world is saved not by war or judgment, but by intoxication, by a ritualized seduction of violence itself. And though the tale ends with joy, its undertones remain eerie, the balance of life and death hinging upon desire and frenzy, the fate of humanity resting on the transformation of wrath into erotic intoxication. Festivals reenacted this myth, with celebrants drinking themselves into delirium, dancing until their bodies blurred into symbols of ecstasy. These rites reveal how the Egyptians understood the precariousness of order. Civilization itself, they believed, could tip into chaos unless desire was ritually honored, unless the raw forces of passion and destruction were redirected into the rhythm of fertility. What modernity might dismiss as indulgence, the Egyptians regarded as survival. Without ecstasy, there was no cosmos. Without desire, the sun itself might falter in its course. The pharaoh's role in such festivals was crucial, for he was the living fulcrum of the balance. If he joined in the revelry, he did so not as man but as Ra, as Horus, as Osiris reborn. His body was the axis between divine and mortal, his seed the anchor of life. When he reclined in the temple chambers, draped in linens perfumed with lotus oil, when priestesses approached him with songs and offerings, when union took place behind veils of incense smoke, it was not considered personal indulgence but public duty. And yet, the duality cannot be ignored. What was framed as cosmic necessity was also deeply personal. The pharaoh's body, his desires, his failures and successes, all became the stage upon which the future of Egypt was written. This merging of personal and political, of body and cosmos, created a constant tension. The pharaoh was praised as godlike, but his human vulnerabilities were dangerous cracks in the facade. Consider the story of Amenhotep III, whose reign was marked by lavish festivals of fertility and renewal. In his later years, inscriptions suggest his health faltered, his body weakened. Priests doubled the rituals, poured more offerings, invoked Min and Hathor with desperate urgency, as if to compensate for the pharaoh's waning vitality. Here desire itself became a battlefield, where age and decay threatened not only the man but the myth. A failing body was not only a personal tragedy, it was a national crisis, a cosmic disturbance. The secrecy surrounding these matters explains why so much of the record has been deliberately erased. When a pharaoh failed in virility, when unions produced no heirs, when rituals faltered, scribes rewrote the narrative. The erotic failures of kings could not be allowed to tarnish their image. The people were told only of success, of endless fertility, of godlike potency. The truth, fragile and human, was buried in tombs and lost in the desert winds. It is this erasure that makes the subject so elusive today, for the record we inherit is polished, curated, censored. To reconstruct the erotic life of the pharaohs is to read shadows and silences, to interpret absence as eloquently as presence. Even so, some traces escaped the censor's hand. In workers' villages such as Deir el-Medina, graffiti survives that hints at the secret life of the elite. Crude drawings of gods with exaggerated phalluses, sketches of couples entwined in explicit acts, inscriptions that blend humor with blasphemy. While these may have been jokes or rebellious mockeries, they also suggest that ordinary Egyptians knew more of the temple's secrets than the priests might have liked. The erotic aura of the pharaohs leaked into the culture at large, transforming into rumor, parody, folk memory. The very act of joking about sacred sex became a form of resistance, a way for the common people to reclaim some power from the divine mystique of their rulers. It is telling, too, how foreign visitors interpreted what they saw. Greek and Roman writers, confronted with Egyptian fertility rituals, recoiled in shock or laughed in derision. To them, raised in cultures where sexuality was increasingly divorced from divinity, the Egyptian blending of sacred and erotic seemed obscene. They exaggerated what they saw, writing tales of orgies and debauchery, painting Egypt as both fascinating and corrupt. Their accounts, though biased, contributed to the long tradition of hiding or distorting Egypt's erotic secrets. By casting them as scandalous, they ensured that later historians would avoid them, preferring to write of pyramids and battles rather than bodies and unions. Yet the truth lingers beneath these distortions. The erotic secrets of the pharaohs were not only about pleasure or scandal, they were about survival, about a worldview in which desire was the engine of creation. To touch another was to echo the gods. To release seed was to participate in cosmic renewal. To dance in ecstasy was to uphold the order of the world. The suppression of these beliefs by later cultures reveals less about Egypt and more about humanity's discomfort with its own origins. For if creation itself began in an act of self-touch, of desire embodied in Adam, then how can any tradition wholly sever sex from sacredness? Let us picture once more the Nile at night. The river moves endlessly, a dark ribbon cutting through the sands. Along its banks, ruined temples stand in silence, their walls etched with symbols that few can read. Yet if one listens closely, if one allows the mind to drift into that liminal space between wakefulness and dream, one might hear the faint sound of sistrums, the whisper of hymns, the sighs of priestesses enacting the oldest of stories. The erotic secrets of the pharaohs are not dead. They linger in stone, in myth, in the silence of history's omissions. They linger in us, unsettling because they remind us that our deepest desires may once have been seen as sacred, and that what we call private was once the very substance of the cosmos. The Nile moved like a ribbon of darkened silver under the gaze of a waning moon, and it was here, upon its patient banks, that Egypt's temples rose, stone upon stone, carved with divine order, yet whispering secrets that few would dare to repeat. The temples, at first glance, were monuments to devotion, to sacrifice, to the cosmic alignment of gods and men. Their colossal columns and sanctuaries seemed designed to awe the common eye, to remind every mortal of the immensity of the divine hierarchy. But beneath these surfaces, within the sanctums only the initiated could enter, a different purpose pulsed, one that entwined pleasure with prayer, erotic initiation with authority. To walk into these hidden spaces was to enter a realm where desire was not condemned but consecrated, where the body was not sinful but sacred, and where power was not merely inherited but performed through acts of flesh and ecstasy. The architecture itself told part of the story, if one knew how to read its silent hieroglyphs. Beyond the familiar pylons and courtyards lay secret chambers known only to priests and priestesses, places where rituals unfolded in darkness, perfumed by resins, and lit by the flicker of oil lamps that cast trembling shadows across the walls. These were not the public sanctuaries where offerings of bread and beer were made before the crowds. These were chambers of intimacy, where statues of the gods were dressed not only in linen and gold but in the suggestion of touch, where hymns were whispered like incantations of seduction, and where the initiate was brought face to face with mysteries that bound erotic experience to the eternal rhythm of the cosmos. To the Egyptians, desire itself was not shameful, it was divine. They saw in the act of creation not only the birth of the universe but the replication of divine intercourse, the eternal coupling of heaven and earth. Nut, the sky goddess, stretched her star-filled body across the heavens, while Geb, the earth god, arched beneath her, their union separated by the decree of Shu, the air. Their separation was tragic, but their longing eternal, and in that yearning the Egyptians saw the secret pattern of life itself. To mimic such cosmic desire was not profanity, it was participation in the eternal cycle. Thus, within the veiled interiors of temples, priests and priestesses enacted dramas of union and separation, rituals that spoke through flesh what words could not. There are scattered accounts, preserved faintly through Greek commentary, of the sacred hieros gamos, the holy marriage performed within Egyptian cults. Most scholars of later centuries dismissed these as misunderstandings, the inventions of foreigners attempting to exoticize Egypt. Yet the evidence lingers, chiseled into faint reliefs, buried in papyri that resisted fire and sand, or hidden in the enigmatic verses of hymns. They suggest that the pharaoh himself, embodying Horus, would unite with a priestess who embodied Hathor or Isis, a ritual act performed not for mere pleasure but for the rejuvenation of the land. As their bodies joined in a sanctified chamber, the Nile itself was believed to respond, swelling with fertile waters, blessing the soil with abundance. The people never saw this rite, it was too dangerous, too potent, but they believed its echoes in the rising floods and the heavy harvests that followed. The priestesses themselves were not mere attendants. They were initiates of the most profound mysteries, women trained from youth in the arts of music, dance, fragrance, and touch. They embodied the goddess, not as actors, but as living vessels of divinity. Their movements were choreographed not only for beauty but for invocation, their voices modulated to carry tones believed to resonate with unseen forces. The erotic was here a language, a grammar of gestures, a vocabulary of caress and rhythm that spoke directly to the gods. To lie with such a priestess was not to indulge in lust but to commune with divinity itself, to cross the thin veil between mortality and eternity. And yet, beneath this exalted ritual lay something more primal, something more unsettling. For while the priests explained that such unions were divine necessity, it was also clear that power and pleasure intermingled in these hidden rites. The pharaoh, already the embodiment of supreme authority, became through the act of sacred sex not only king of Egypt but progenitor of its fertility, the very axis upon which the cosmic will turned. His virility was not private but public, its effects rippling outward across field and floodplain. Thus, the potency of his body became entwined with the potency of his rule. If he faltered in these sacred acts, if the goddess did not receive his offering, then drought, famine, or rebellion might follow. The stakes of desire were, therefore, no less than the fate of the realm. This intermingling of pleasure and politics is what unsettled later chroniclers. For how could one reconcile the sanctity of temples with the suggestion of fleshly indulgence? How could one admit that the divine rituals upon which Egypt's survival depended were acts of ecstasy, of groaning, of climax, of whispered prayers that mingled with moans? The Greeks wrote of it with fascination and disdain, the Romans spoke of it with scandal. And so, across centuries, these erotic secrets were pushed further into silence, recorded less and less, until they became little more than rumor, faint shadows lingering behind the grandeur of Egypt's monuments. Yet the Nile remembers, and the stones do not forget. Reliefs in Dendera show Hathor, goddess of love and intoxication, smiling with enigmatic eyes, her cult renowned for its ecstatic festivals where music, drink, and dance blurred the boundaries between devotion and desire. The precincts of Karnak and Luxor still hold inscriptions invoking fertility rites, their meanings scrubbed and reinterpreted by centuries of cautious translators. And in the Temple of Mut, scholars uncovered carvings that hint at rituals of union, where priestesses held sistrums and lotus flowers, symbols of sexuality and rebirth, as they moved in circular procession. The evidence remains, though veiled, waiting for those willing to read the silences as carefully as the words. As the evening deepened along the Nile, the initiate would be led by torchlight into the inner chamber. He or she would have bathed in scented oils, fasted to purify the body, and learned the hymns to recite as the doors closed. The chamber was dim, its walls painted with celestial scenes, Nut bending above, stars glittering in her belly, the sun reborn between her thighs each dawn. The priestess entered slowly, adorned not in jewels but in fragrance, the sweet smoke of Kifi rising around her. The initiate knelt, not in subservience but in awe, for before them stood not merely a woman but the goddess incarnate. When she touched them, it was not the hand of flesh but the hand of Hathor, of Isis, of Sekhmet, fierce and tender at once. Every kiss, every movement, was a prayer, and every climax was a moment of revelation, a brief glimpse of eternity through the trembling of the mortal body. This is what the temples concealed, the knowledge that the erotic was not a deviation but a key, a gateway through which one might step into the eternal. To experience desire was to taste the hunger of the gods, to give oneself was to replicate the eternal sacrifice of Osiris dismembered and reassembled by Isis, to take in pleasure was to mirror the abundance of the Nile spilling across its banks. These rites were not indulgences but necessities. And yet, they were dangerous, for power sought to harness them, and secrecy wrapped them in silence. It is no wonder that history, in its sternness, sought to erase them, to leave only the surface of temples and the outlines of myths, while beneath, the heartbeat of erotic ritual pulsed on in whispers. The night air along the river carried the sound of unseen insects, the shifting lap of water, the sighing of reeds. Imagine yourself there, following the flame deeper into the temple, knowing that beyond the stone threshold lies not only the divine but the unveiling of your own body as sacred text. The journey is not merely historical, it is initiatory. For in these chambers of ancient Egypt, history itself was written not only in ink and stone but in touch and desire, in breath and rhythm, in the hidden joining of flesh and spirit. And so, we begin not with judgment, but with meditation. To know Egypt is to know that it never drew harsh lines between the sacred and the sensual, between the god and the lover. Here, in the hidden temples of pleasure, the two were one. The body was the altar, the act was the sacrifice, and through it the land itself was nourished. It is a truth too unsettling for later ages to bear, and yet it lingers, waiting, as all secrets do, for the patient listener in the silence of the night. The torchlight wavered against the carved stone walls, illuminating the delicate images that seemed to shift under the eye, lotus flowers unfolding, serpents winding in spirals, lovers entangled in postures at once graceful and otherworldly. These were not idle decorations. They were diagrams of ritual, maps of the erotic mysteries, preserved for those who could read them. To the uninitiated, they might appear to be strange ornaments, but to the trained initiate, each curve of the carved body, each tilt of the painted hand, each intertwined form was a key to unlock the hidden choreography of the temple rites. In this way, the stones themselves became teachers, whispering their wisdom to those who carried the courage to look beneath the veil of propriety. Imagine standing in such a chamber, the air heavy with incense, the distant hum of chanting echoing from unseen corridors. You would be aware not only of your own breath but of the breath of countless generations who had entered these same spaces, stripped of shame, clothed instead in reverence. The body here was not a vessel of sin but a bridge, a passageway through which the divine descended and the mortal ascended. The act of touch was not defilement but invocation. And each movement of the body was believed to mirror the movements of the stars, those great celestial bodies that themselves were caught in eternal orbits of attraction and release. The goddess Hathor was often at the center of these rites. She was not only the goddess of love and beauty but also of music, intoxication, and divine ecstasy. Her festivals were legendary, occasions when barriers between human and divine thinned until they nearly dissolved. Drums pounded in rhythms that mimicked the heartbeat, sistrums rattled in hypnotic cadence, and dancers moved in undulating patterns that suggested both serpent and river. Within the temple, these external festivals became inward mysteries. The priestess embodying Hathor did not merely simulate the goddess, she became her, drawing down her presence into flesh and voice, offering herself as a conduit of divine desire. To lie with her was to lie with the goddess, to hear her song was to hear the music that echoed at the dawn of creation. These unions were not casual. They were structured by ritual, guarded by secrecy, and saturated with symbolism. Oils pressed from lotus and blue water lily, both known for their intoxicating and possibly psychoactive effects, were smeared across skin. Their scents carried the initiate into altered states, making the body more receptive to touch, more open to vision. The sacred couch upon which union occurred was carved with images of lions and doves, symbols of ferocity and gentleness intertwined. The room itself was oriented to the heavens, its ceiling painted with stars, its floor designed as the primordial waters, so that the bodies entwined above became a living enactment of the cosmos itself, heaven and earth, fire and water, masculine and feminine, locked in sacred embrace. And yet, there was always an edge of unease within these practices. For while they elevated the erotic to the realm of the divine, they also carried the risk of corruption. Power clung to such rituals, for whoever controlled access to the goddess controlled the channels of fertility and kingship. A priestess of Hathor, Isis, or Mut could sway the balance of the temple, and through it, the fate of the land. If she withheld herself, the pharaoh's potency was called into question. If she bestowed herself, his legitimacy was confirmed. Thus, pleasure became political, and ecstasy became a stage upon which power was tested. Later scribes, anxious to guard authority, may have obscured or erased these details, fearing their dangerous implications. It is here that one begins to understand why history has struggled to retain these truths. To admit that power was ratified through acts of desire, that kingdoms were blessed by the groans of union, that divinity could be touched in sweat and breath. This was too disquieting for later ages of austerity. The Greeks, though fascinated, reframed the rites as degeneracy. The Romans mocked them as excess. The Christians condemned them as blasphemy. And so the silence grew, covering the temples with a veil of forgetfulness, even as the stones remained, carrying their faintly carved witnesses. The hieroglyph for life, the Ankh, was itself a symbol charged with erotic power. It resembled both the womb and the phallus, the key and the union. To hold it was not merely to gesture toward life eternal, but to acknowledge the generative act that produced life itself. Many depictions show gods pressing the Ankh to the lips of pharaohs, granting them breath, but some more obscure images suggest that the Ankh was placed upon other parts of the body, the navel, even the groin, in silent acknowledgement of the sacred source of vitality. Within the temples, such symbols were not abstract, they were embodied, enacted, and lived. Whispers tell of special initiatory orders, groups of men and women trained not only in prayer but in the art of erotic invocation. They were taught to control their breath, to modulate the rhythms of arousal, to withhold and release at precise moments aligned with celestial timings. They became masters of the body's energies, directing them like the currents of the Nile, channeling desire into vision, and vision into prophecy. Some say they could bring themselves to ecstasy without touch, merely by chant and breath, vibrating with the resonance of the gods. Others say that they could transmit healing through the laying of hands, their erotic charge transforming into vital force. These were dangerous skills, and so they were hidden, passed only from teacher to chosen disciple, concealed within riddles and metaphors in papyri that scholars struggle to interpret even now. Consider the Osirian mysteries. Osiris, dismembered by his jealous brother Seth, was reassembled by Isis, who fashioned for him a phallus of gold when the original had been swallowed by a fish. With this, she conceived Horus, restoring life to the god and continuity to the throne. This myth was not only told in story but reenacted in ritual. The phallus of Osiris became a central symbol of regeneration, its image hidden in temples, its power invoked in secret ceremonies. To unite with Isis in ritual was to participate in the resurrection of Osiris, to join death and life through the erotic. Such rites cannot have been mere metaphor, they were bodily, enacted, experienced. The ecstasy of the initiate was not private indulgence but participation in the cosmic rebirth. There is evidence, faint but persistent, that initiates were sometimes blindfolded as they entered the innermost chambers. The removal of sight heightened touch, taste, and smell, deepening the awareness of each caress, each kiss, each whispered word. The initiate did not know whether the hand upon their body was that of a mortal priestess or of the goddess herself. This blurring of mortal and divine was intentional, dissolving the boundary between the human and the eternal. In this state, climax was not simply release, it was a tearing of the veil, a brief annihilation of the self into the infinite. Some initiates emerged trembling, claiming to have seen visions of light exploding from within. Others collapsed into sobs, undone by the intimacy of their communion. The erotic mysteries were not gentle, they were transformative, and transformation is never without its shadow. But shadows deepen further when one considers the secrecy surrounding these rites. For what was hidden can easily be twisted, misunderstood, or abused. Were all the participants willing? Did every priestess embrace her role, or did some bear it as a burden, sacrificed not only to the gods but to the ambitions of men? Was the pharaoh himself always the triumphant partner, or did some falter, trembling under the weight of expectation, their inadequacy cloaked in silence? These questions disturbed the serenity of the narrative, suggesting that even within the sacred, the human frailty of power and desire played out. Perhaps this, too, is why history sought to hide these truths, not only because they were erotic, but because they revealed the vulnerability of rulers, the entanglement of politics and pleasure, the unsettling reality that even kings were judged in the chamber of ecstasy. And yet, despite centuries of erasure, the temples still murmur. Reliefs weathered by sandstorms still show the lotus blooming in suggestive symmetry, the cowiered face of Hathor smiling enigmatically, the embrace of gods and mortals carved in half-hidden alcoves. Archaeologists who stumble upon these images debate their meaning, some daring to suggest the erotic, others retreating into safer translations. But the body knows what the scholar denies. The body recognizes in these images its own language, its own rhythms, its own sacred hungers. Imagine the night once more. The initiate lies upon the sacred couch, oils glistening, breath trembling. The priestess moves like a river, her body an instrument of invocation. Around them, unseen in the shadows, the priests chant low hymns, their voices vibrating through the stone. The air is thick with the scent of myrrh, lotus, and resin. The climax comes not as a shout but as a silence, a moment when the heart stops and the world dissolves. In that instant, the initiate becomes one with Nut stretching across the heavens, with Geb pressing upward from the earth, with Osiris resurrected and Isis triumphant. In that instant, flesh is no longer flesh, but cosmos itself, eternally cycling, eternally renewed. This is the secret the temples guarded, the secret history tried to erase, that the erotic is not merely base but divine, not merely indulgence but necessity. To experience pleasure was to glimpse eternity, to embody the gods, to nourish the land. To suppress this knowledge was to silence a vital dimension of the sacred. And so history wrote its story without these details, leaving us with broken myths and censored translations, while the truth lingered in shadows, waiting for those willing to listen to the whispers of stone, water, and flesh. In the end, the hidden temples of pleasure remind us that the past is not as distant as we think. The body remembers what history forgets. The stones of Egypt hold within them not only the grandeur of empire but the softness of touch, the rhythm of breath, the mystery of desire sanctified. To uncover these truths is to confront both the beauty and the terror of what it means to be human, fragile, longing, yearning always for union, whether with another, with the gods, or with eternity itself. The myths of Egypt were not idle tales told to amuse restless children or to adorn temple walls with fanciful stories. They were living codes, vessels of mystery, and through them the Egyptians glimpsed truths about life, death, and the eternal cycles that bound them. To read these myths with modern eyes is to risk misunderstanding, for what later cultures dismissed as crude or indecent, the Egyptians revered as sacred. Within their tales, desire was not hidden in shame, it was exposed as the very mechanism of creation. The gods themselves were not aloof, austere beings without longing, they were creatures of passion, hunger, jealousy, and embrace. And in their coupling, their betrayals, their yearning, the Egyptians saw the mirror of the cosmos itself. At the center of these erotic myths stood Adam, the self-created God, the one who emerged from the primordial waters at the dawn of time. Alone in the darkness of none, without companion or consort, Adam brought forth creation through his own desire. Some texts describe him fashioning the first gods by spitting or sneezing them into being, but others speak more directly, of his hand becoming his wife, of his seed falling into the waters, of his solitary ecstasy sparking the flame of creation. To the Egyptians, this was not shameful, it was a profound truth. Creation itself was erotic, born of longing, of release, of the union between the solitary self and the infinite. From Adam's act came Shu, the god of air, and Tefnut, the goddess of moisture, their names already charged with sensual meaning. They embraced, they separated, they quarreled, and they returned, enacting in divine drama the rhythms of desire and distance, of intimacy and estrangement. Their children, Geb and Nut, carried these themes further. Geb, the fertile earth, lay entwined with Nut, the arching sky, locked in embrace so passionate that Shu, their father, was forced to separate them, pushing Nut upward into the heavens and pressing Geb down into the soil. Their longing, however, never ceased. Night after night, Nut bends low toward her lover, her body stretched across the stars, while Geb presses upward, their yearning inscribed in the very shape of the cosmos. Each sunrise is their brief union, the sunchild born anew from Nut's womb, and each sunset is their separation, destined to repeat eternally. This cosmic love affair was not an idle metaphor. For the Egyptians, it explained the very cycles of fertility, of the Nile's flooding and retreating, of the sowing and harvest, of birth and death. Nut and Geb's eternal longing was a mirror of human desire, sanctified and woven into the stars. To speak of love, to speak of hunger for the touch of another, was not to speak of sin but to echo the yearning that sustained the universe. Every kiss, every embrace, every coupling between mortals was, in miniature, a replication of that divine drama. Yet Egyptian mythology also preserved darker, stranger tales of divine sexuality. Consider Isis and Osiris, the eternal lovers. Their bond was one of devotion and tenderness, but it was tested by betrayal. Seth, the brother of Osiris, murdered him and scattered his body across Egypt. Isis, grieving and relentless, gathered the pieces of her beloved, but the phallus of Osiris had been lost to the waters, devoured by a fish. Undeterred, she fashioned a golden replacement, and through her magic and her longing, she mounted his corpse, conceiving Horus, the Avenger. In this act, desire conquered death, fertility triumphed over annihilation, and love remade the cosmos. To later ages, this myth was obscene, a grotesque mingling of necromancy and sexuality. To the Egyptians, it was the deepest of mysteries, that even in death, love endures, and through erotic union, new life emerges. The myth of Horus and Seth is even more unsettling, though no less revealing. After Osiris's death, Horus, his son, and Seth, his murderous uncle, fought for the throne of Egypt. Their battle was not only waged with weapons but with bodies. In one version, Seth attempted to dominate Horus sexually, hoping to humiliate him and claim supremacy. Yet Horus, cunning and vigilant, caught Seth's seed in his hands and cast it away. Later, Horus tricked Seth into consuming his own semen, hidden in food, turning the tables of domination into ridicule. These details, shocking to modern ears, were not mere obscenity. They revealed a profound truth, that power itself could be expressed through the erotic, that to conquer or to resist could be written upon the body as much as upon the battlefield. The myth was a warning and a lesson, a tale of cunning, resilience, and the intimate struggles that underpinned the throne. Even Ra, the great sun god, was not free from desire. In some hymns, he is described as father and lover, his rays penetrating the womb of the sky, his heat inseminating the earth. The daily rising of the sun was itself an act of creation, a cosmic consummation between light and matter, repeated eternally. The Egyptians did not separate the natural from the erotic. The warmth of the sun, the rising of the flood, the swelling of crops, these were all the touch of gods upon the body of the world. The eroticism of the divine was not only mythological. It spilled into ritual, into the festivals where gods and mortals met in states of ecstasy. The festival of Hathor at Dendra, for instance, was known for its intoxicating excess. Wine flowed freely, music filled the air, and the people abandoned restraint, dancing and singing in a frenzy of joy. Some accounts suggest that these festivals included acts of public lovemaking, not as indulgence but as offering, the people reenacting the divine unions to bless the land. The line between worshipper and God blurred, for in ecstasy, each person became a vessel of Hathor herself, radiant with desire, overflowing with life. It is no accident that so many of these myths and rituals center upon fertility, upon the generative power of sex. To the Egyptians, there was no separation between erotic desire and the survival of the kingdom. The Nile must flood, the crops must grow, the people must multiply, and the gods themselves must reenact their eternal couplings. If desire faltered, if ritual was neglected, then famine and chaos might follow. The erotic was not a private indulgence, it was a cosmic necessity. But myths have shadows, and their erotic revelations carry unease. When Isis reanimated Osiris with her magic phallus, did she not transgress the boundary between life and death? When Seth attempted to dominate Horus, did he not expose the vulnerability of the divine order? When Adam brought forth creation through his own ecstasy, did he not reveal the loneliness and desperation that lie at the root of being? These questions haunt the myths, making them more than simple tales of love and fertility. They are explorations of the fragility of creation, the precariousness of order, and the dangerous power of desire. Later cultures recoiled from these stories. The Greeks, encountering the Egyptian tales, recorded them with embarrassment, often reframing them as allegories to soften their unsettling power. The Romans mocked them as grotesque. Early Christian writers condemned them outright, holding them as proof of pagan depravity. But in dismissing these myths, they also dismissed the truth that the Egyptians had long embraced, that the erotic is inseparable from the sacred, that longing is not weakness but the root of creation, that even gods must wrestle with desire. Within the temples, the myths were not only recited but performed. Priests and priestesses embodied the gods, enacting their unions, their struggles, their reconciliations. To witness such a rite was to step into the myth itself, to blur the boundary between story and reality. When the priestess of Isis lay upon the sacred bed, and the pharaoh mounted her as Osiris, the people believed that the myth was not retold but relived, that the cosmos itself was renewed in that instant of union. The body became scripture, the act became liturgy, and pleasure became revelation. The Egyptians did not ask whether such rites were obscene. They asked only whether they were effective. Did the Nile rise? Did the crops flourish? Did the people prosper? Their standard of truth was not moral but practical, not abstract but embodied. If desire could bring life, then desire was holy. If pleasure could renew the kingdom, then pleasure was necessary. It is only through the filters of later ages that such truths become dangerous, shameful, or forgotten. The myths, however, remain. They whisper across time, their strangeness both alluring and unsettling. They remind us that the divine is not sterile, not distant, not stripped of hunger. The divine is tangled in longing, in embrace, in ecstasy and grief, just as we are. To encounter these myths is to encounter ourselves, stripped of pretense, revealed in our most primal truth, that we are creatures of desire, and in our desire, we mirror the gods. And so the chamber of myth opens before us, a space where stories are not merely told but lived, where the gods themselves invite us to see in their couplings the eternal rhythms of existence. It is a space at once comforting and disquieting, for in its shadows we glimpse both the holiness of longing and its capacity to unsettle. To listen to these myths with open ears is to hear not only the voice of Egypt but the echo of our own hidden truths. If one listens carefully enough to the murmur of the stones at Abydos, it is as though they whisper of unions not meant for mortal ears. The walls carved with endless figures of gods and kings do not only tell tales of lineage and conquest, but of bodies pressed together in intimacy, of forces unleashed when desire was ritualized and sanctified. To walk through these corridors of silence is to feel one's skin prickle with the residue of centuries-old acts once performed under torchlight and chant, acts not meant to entertain but to tether human lives to the will of the divine. And though the sands have shifted, covering much of what was once openly celebrated, enough fragments remain to stir the imagination, to leave us haunted by the suspicion that sexuality itself was once a bridge between realms. In the heart of these mysteries lies the belief that physical ecstasy was more than mere indulgence. For the Egyptians, the joining of bodies was a microcosm of cosmic events, a mortal reenactment of the eternal dance between earth and sky, water and land, creation and destruction. The god Geb was said to tremble in constant union with Nut, the sky goddess, her body arching protectively above the earth. The separation of their embrace by Shu, the air, was not merely myth, it was metaphor, an acknowledgement that creation itself came from a sundered intimacy. To imitate such unions was not to indulge in scandal, but to enact a rite of profound remembrance. Yet what does it mean that so many of these acts were gradually concealed, that later ages worked so diligently to cloak them in silence? Perhaps it was because the knowledge that pleasure itself could summon gods was too dangerous to leave unchecked. The ceremonies of fertility often involved more than symbolic gestures. Temple walls once bore inscriptions of priests and priestesses offering themselves in sacred unions, believing that their bodies became conduits for divine power. These unions, described in fragmentary hymns, were not clandestine, but public performances, witnessed by initiates who believed that the pleasure coursing through the bodies of the chosen was an echo of the primal surge that brought forth the Nile's waters each year. The trembling of flesh mirrored the trembling of soil when kissed by floods, and from this trembling, abundance would follow. But the thought that pleasure could summon prosperity unsettled later chroniclers, who preferred to tell tales of plows, laws, and decrees rather than of moans and whispers beneath temple rafters. One of the most haunting of these traditions surrounded the festival of Min, god of fertility, often represented with exaggerated virility. The rituals, glimpsed through broken reliefs and faint inscriptions, suggest processions where offerings of lettuce, symbols of vitality, were carried alongside phallic effigies. The cult of Min was not simply the celebration of reproduction, but the acknowledgement that sexuality itself was the pulse of life. Pilgrims would travel for days to witness rituals of unashamed power, where men and women enacted what the gods had once performed, their movements a prayer in flesh. The ecstatic cries that rose into the night air were themselves offerings, carried like smoke into the eternal realm. But when the Greeks and Romans encountered these practices, they were scandalized, reducing them to caricature, stripping away the holiness and leaving behind only ridicule. It was easier to laugh at what they did not understand than to reckon with the possibility that ecstasy was once a form of communion. As the centuries turned, new rulers sought to suppress such ceremonies. The Christian chroniclers who came later described them as obscene, the Muslim historians as remnants of pagan excess. And yet, buried beneath these condemnations, the traces remain. Min's image, chiseled crudely by zealots, still looms in quiet defiance on temple walls. His enduring presence is a reminder that desire cannot truly be erased, only hidden, only forced underground. In the cracks of history, in the marginalia of forgotten texts, the erotic secrets of the pharaohs still pulse like a vein beneath the skin of time, waiting for us to feel their quiet rhythm. The rituals of Osiris and Isis, too, were steeped in erotic symbolism. The myth of Osiris's dismemberment and Isis's desperate search for his body speaks of grief, but also of longing. When Isis reassembled him, fashioning from gold the missing phallus lost to the Nile, her act was more than mourning, it was desire sanctified, a ritual declaration that union must transcend death. In some hymns, she is described as mounting the god's restored body, conceiving Horus through a sacred coupling. The image of a goddess making love to her resurrected husband is as unsettling as it is tender, for it proclaims that sexuality is not merely of the living, but of eternity. Priests reenacted these unions in secret chambers, invoking not only fertility but continuity itself. And yet, modern retelling stripped the myth of its flesh, leaving only its bones, a tale of death, rebirth, and vengeance, sanitized for comfort. Consider, too, the female form in Egyptian art, its elegance captured not in shame but in celebration. The curves of hips, the fullness of breasts, the tilt of eyes, they were rendered not to titillate but to honor, to remind that beauty itself was divine. Erotic papyri, preserved in fragments, reveal scenes of women reclining, men approaching, acts performed with frankness that surprises us today. These images were not hidden away in shame, but kept as reminders that intimacy was natural, powerful, essential. To study them now, under the cold lights of museums, is to feel the eerie dissonance between the past and our present discomfort. What they displayed openly, we have learned to conceal. What they considered holy, we often dismiss as vulgar. The echoes of these practices ripple into questions of power. To rule Egypt was not only to command armies and grain, but to embody the fertility of the land itself. Pharaohs were seen as husbands to the Nile, fathers to their people, lovers of the gods. Their virility was not a private matter but a public concern, their potency a metaphor for the prosperity of all. In certain ceremonies, it is said the pharaoh himself performed acts of intimacy before the people, his body a vessel of divine assurance. Such claims, recorded in veiled language by distant chroniclers, suggest a blurring of the line between ruler and ritual. Yet the implications were too scandalous for later interpreters, who sought instead to recast the pharaoh as austere, detached, godlike in majesty but not in flesh. The repression of these traditions was not accidental. With each new wave of conquest, with each shift of ideology, the erotic layers of Egyptian ritual were scraped away, replaced with tales more palatable to those who feared the power of desire. The Greeks mocked, the Romans censored, the Christians condemned, the Muslims purified. And yet, the deeper one digs, the more persistent the traces become. It is almost as though Egypt herself, the Eternal Mother, refuses to let us forget that she was once awakened through intimacy, her rivers swollen by passion, her soil fertilized by ritual acts of love. There is something unsettling in realizing that what we call obscenity was once sacred, that the moans of pleasure were once hymns, that the body itself was once scripture. To acknowledge this is to feel a shift within, a disquieting reminder that our boundaries between holiness and desire are not universal, but cultural, fragile, shifting like dunes in the desert wind. Perhaps this is why history tried to bury these truths, why stone was chiseled, why scrolls were burned. For to admit them is to destabilize our own certainties, to confront the possibility that what we hide today may once again be revered tomorrow. As we move deeper into these shadows, we are forced to ask what it means that the Egyptians saw no contradiction between sex and sanctity. Was their world more primal, or more enlightened? Were their rituals mere indulgence, or windows into truths we have lost? In their temples, flesh and spirit were not enemies, but allies, weaving together in the dim light of torches, in the trembling voices of chants, in the silent witness of stone. To walk among their ruins is to feel the weight of this hidden knowledge pressing upon us, as though the air itself remembers what our books have forgotten. And so, we find ourselves standing at the threshold of revelation and concealment. We see fragments of unions carved into crumbling walls, echoes of festivals sung through broken hymns, whispers of bodies once trembling in sacred rhythm. And though time and dogma have worked to silence them, their secrets persist, waiting for those willing to listen. For in the erotic rites of the pharaohs lies not only a hidden history, but a mirror held up to our own fears, our own longing, our own fragile understanding of where holiness ends and desire begins. There are chambers within the great temples of Egypt that seem to breathe with a silence heavier than stone. Step beyond the outer courtyards, where incense once curled into the daylight, and the air shifts. Here, in the inner sanctuaries, whispers become dangerous. These were not spaces meant for the common people, nor even for the lower ranks of priesthood. These were the hidden places, the veiled corridors where only the initiated could pass, where the mysteries of the body and the divine converged in acts the world was never meant to fully witness. And yet, the stones remember. The walls, though scarred by time, still exude the faint, almost imperceptible echo of movements, gestures, and sighs that once summoned gods into flesh. We must begin in Luxor, for the temple complex there seems to breathe with erotic undertones in ways few are willing to acknowledge. The grand axis of the temple, aligned with cosmic precision, draws the body into a rhythm that is almost sensual. Processions would once flow down this pathway, bodies swaying, chants rising, dancers clad in nothing but sheer linen veils, their movements not mere performance but ritual seduction meant to entice the gods themselves. The king, at the head of the procession, was not a passive figure but an active participant, embodying the role of lover, husband, or even consort to the divine. At certain junctures of the festival calendar, the god Ammonius was said to merge with the pharaoh, not just in spirit but in flesh, through the medium of ritual acts that blurred the boundaries between human and divine intimacy. One account, though fragmentary, hints that sacred prostitutes, priestesses trained in both the arts of devotion and pleasure, would offer themselves within the temple precincts, their bodies treated as vessels through which Ammonius or Hathor might descend. To modern ears, this sounds scandalous, a profanation. But to the Egyptians, such acts were not shameful. They were bridges. In the joining of two mortal bodies, the divine was coaxed into presence, the temple becoming a chamber not of stone alone but of living ecstasy. And if the god came, it was not through thunder or lightning, but through trembling flesh and breathless climax, through the momentary dissolution of separation. One must understand that to the Egyptians, sexuality was not compartmentalized. It was not a private act walled off from the sacred. It was the sacred. The female body was a symbol of the fertile Nile, swelling and overflowing, while the male was the inundating waters, surging with generative force. Their union was the ritual reenactment of the very cycles that governed the universe. And within the temple walls, this was expressed not through sterile prayers but through movements, touches, penetrations that mirrored creation itself. To deny this is to strip Egyptian ritual of its deepest pulse, yet most historians have done just that, turning away from the uncomfortable reality that holiness and desire were once indistinguishable. The Temple of Hathor at Dendera preserves some of the most tantalizing traces. Hathor, goddess of love, music, and joy, was often depicted with the face of a cow, her eyes large and soft, her body radiant with fertility. But she was also goddess of intoxication, of ecstasy, of sexual pleasure. The Dendera temple's reliefs show musicians and dancers, sistrums rattling, drums pounding, bodies in swaying motion. The music was not merely entertainment, it was incantation, designed to arouse, to dissolve inhibitions, to summon within the participants the very frenzy of desire. Some rituals involved the pouring of wine until the boundaries of self were loosened, until the worshippers moved together in a haze of song, dance, and flesh. The festival of drunkenness, associated with Hathor, was not only about inebriation, but about unleashing the raw currents of pleasure. In this, one can glimpse a world where temple floors once throbbed with footsteps, laughter, and the cries of bodies given over to passion, a sacred theater of flesh that modern eyes can scarcely imagine. Yet the most unsettling of these practices may have been the divine marriage rituals, wherein the pharaoh himself was joined with the goddess. In certain texts, he is described as the living Horus, uniting with Hathor, the celestial mother, or as Ammonius incarnate, coupling with mortal priestesses embodying the goddess. These unions were not metaphorical, they were enacted with full gravity. The pharaoh, stripped of regalia, was not king but lover, his body consecrated by the act. Those who witnessed such rites described them in hushed tones, suggesting that to watch was to stand on the edge of madness, for in that moment the veil between human and God was torn open by pleasure itself. The pharaoh's potency was not merely a personal matter but the guarantee of the nation's fertility. If he failed, the land withered. If he succeeded, abundance flowed. Thus, his body was a living altar, his desire a force upon which the fate of thousands depended. The erotic papyri of Turin offer glimpses of what may have been ritual manuals disguised as entertainment. Their images of exaggerated couplings, men and women entwined in poses both acrobatic and intimate, have often been dismissed as pornography. But look closer, and the iconography echoes temple symbolism, the positioning of bodies aligned with cosmic hierarchies, the presence of sacred objects within scenes of intimacy, the suggestion that pleasure was not random but patterned, ritualized. Could these papyri have been playful reflections of rites once performed behind closed temple doors? Or were they themselves teaching tools for initiates, illustrating how the body could be manipulated into sacred geometry, each union a reenactment of cosmic order? The possibility unsettles, for it suggests that even the most explicit of images was not profane but holy. The deeper one goes into these mysteries, the more one senses that what we have preserved are only fragments, and that the true essence of these rites has been deliberately erased. When Egypt fell under Roman rule, many of these practices were curtailed, transformed into spectacles stripped of their original meaning. Sacred dances became entertainment for audiences who no longer believed in their power. Priestesses were reduced to concubines, their rituals forgotten. By the time the Christian chroniclers arrived, the memory of sacred sexuality had already been buried beneath centuries of distortion. They found only faint echoes, which they condemned as debauchery, obliterating the sacred context. And yet, despite this systematic erasure, something lingers. To stand within the darkened sanctuary of Karnak, to trace one's fingers along the stone carved with symbols of fertility, is to feel the residue of a world where intimacy was cosmic, where desire was destiny, where the gods themselves were summoned not through fear but through passion. One can almost hear it, if one listens long enough, the faint sound of music rising from the past, the rattle of sistrums, the sighs of priestesses, the pharaoh's voice trembling with both authority and longing. These were not acts of sin, but of sanctity, performed with reverence beneath ceilings painted with stars. The thought that sex could summon gods, that pleasure itself was a prayer, unsettles modern sensibilities. And perhaps this is precisely why history has tried so hard to conceal it. To admit it would be to admit that our bodies are not shameful, but divine, that our longings are not trivial, but essential, that ecstasy is not an indulgence, but a doorway. The Egyptians believed this. They built temples as theaters for it, carved images of it into stone, and entrusted their kings with the sacred duty of embodying it. But we, inheritors of centuries of repression, can only half believe, half shudder, caught between fascination and denial. As the story unfolds, we are left with a picture of Egyptian religion as something uncomfortably intimate. Not the distant worship of aloof gods, but a trembling nearness where flesh itself became the medium of holiness. It is a picture history has tried to bury, chiseling away images, burning papyri, rewriting myths into allegories stripped of their carnal force. Yet the whispers persist. In the shadows of temple walls, in the fragments of erotic art, in the hushed accounts of ancient festivals, we catch glimpses of a truth too raw to be contained. And so, as we prepare to move deeper, we stand on the threshold of revelation and repression, sensing that what has been hidden is not gone, only waiting. The erotic secrets of the pharaohs remain etched in silence, trembling beneath the weight of centuries, ready to remind us that desire was once the holiest of prayers. The further we descend into the shadows of Egypt's temples, the more the air thickens with a kind of invisible residue, as though the walls themselves hold the breath of rituals that once transformed flesh into sacrament. We introduced the spectacle of sacred processions, drunken festivals, and the divine marriage of gods and kings, and why must linger on what lay hidden even deeper, in the chambers sealed from ordinary eyes, in the rites performed by whispers alone, where the erotic became the unspoken engine of cosmic continuity. For in these places, the line between desire and divinity dissolved completely. It is said that in the innermost sanctuaries of the great temples, rituals of intimacy were not only performed but refined into deliberate practices of transcendence. The Egyptians understood that pleasure, when harnessed, was a force that could bend reality itself. The body was not seen as an obstacle to spiritual ascent but as the vessel by which it was achieved. Priests and priestesses trained for years in the art of touch, in the mysteries of arousal, in the precise movements and breath patterns that could summon not just ecstasy but visions. These practices have been all but erased, surviving only in faint metaphors that scholars often mistake for poetry. A hymn describing a goddess rising like the flood, swelling with joy, flowing over the earth, was perhaps not a pastoral metaphor but a coded description of the feminine orgasm as cosmic revelation. Such practices may have reached their fullest expression in the cult of Hathor. Her priestesses were not merely singers and dancers, but custodians of erotic mysteries. In certain accounts, now fragmented and heavily censored, we read of nights of rapture within her temples, where initiates were guided into trance by the rhythmic movements of sacred partners. These unions were not performed in isolation but as part of collective rituals, the air thick with music and incense, the bodies of participants glistening with oil, painted with symbols of fertility and protection. The act of coupling was timed with chants, with drum beats, with the cycles of the moon, all woven together to align mortal bodies with the greater rhythm of the cosmos. What occurred was not indulgence but alignment, not debauchery but synchronization with the pulse of the divine. The Greeks, who later entered Egypt, described some of these rites with both fascination and revulsion. Herodotus, though careful with his words, hinted at festivals in which women gave themselves freely to strangers as offerings to the goddess. While historians debate the accuracy of his reports, it is possible that his accounts were distorted reflections of rituals where intimacy was considered not personal but collective, a sacrament shared for the good of the community. If each body was a temple, then to join together was to merge temples, to create a greater sanctum, a living cathedral of flesh. Yet Herodotus, unable to understand the sanctity beneath the act, recorded it as a curiosity tinged with scandal. Later chroniclers exaggerated, reducing complex rites to stories of licentious orgies, stripping away the sacred in favor of mockery. The secrecy surrounding these practices was not only to shield them from outsiders but to preserve their potency. Knowledge of sacred sexuality was considered dangerous if misused, for to wield desire without reverence was to invite chaos. Thus, initiates were sworn to silence. Only the most trusted priestesses, only the pharaoh himself, only those who had undergone long purification and training, were permitted to enact the holiest of unions. To break these vows was unthinkable, a crime against both gods and people. The fact that so little remains of these practices today is perhaps evidence not of their absence, but of the extraordinary success of this secrecy. What scraps we recover, broken reliefs, half-burned papyri, vague metaphors, are the faint embers of a fire that once roared brightly but was carefully banked, hidden away from prying eyes. But what of the pharaoh himself, the axis upon which the kingdom turned? His role in these rites cannot be overstated. His body was not his own, it belonged to Egypt. In the divine marriage rituals, in the enactments of Osiris's resurrection, in the sacred festivals of fertility, the pharaoh was the lover not just of goddesses, but of the land itself. His sexual potency symbolized the vigor of the Nile, the abundance of harvests, the survival of his people. Failure in these duties was not a private shame but a cosmic disaster. There are whispers, recorded obliquely in late writings, that some pharaohs resorted to substitutes when their own virility faltered, employing ritual surrogates who would perform the acts in their stead. Yet even here, the illusion was maintained, the pharaoh's role had to be embodied, even if the body was not his own. For the cycle could not be broken, the union could not be denied, lest Egypt itself wither. It is unsettling to consider that the might of one of the world's greatest civilizations rested not only on armies, grain stores, and bureaucracies, but on acts of intimacy performed in shadowed chambers. Yet perhaps this is precisely why such truths were later buried. To admit that pleasure was central to power is to destabilize the narrative of conquest and law, to replace the image of the stern, godlike Pharaoh with one trembling in ritual embrace. Later historians preferred to emphasize battle and decree, omitting the bedchamber, the temple rite, the moans that once echoed as loudly as war cries. Yet beneath the sanitized surface, the truth waits, unsettling, undeniable. The Turin erotic papyri return here, for they remind us that the Egyptians did not shy from depicting explicit acts. Scholars call them bawdy, humorous, obscene. Yet when placed in the context of temple ritual, one wonders if these images served as more than amusement. Were they illustrations of positions designed to maximize ritual alignment? Were they symbolic demonstrations of cosmic principles, the balance of opposites, the union of sky and earth, the spiral of energy through flesh? If so, what we call pornography was, in their eyes, scripture. To imagine priests and priestesses studying these drawings as guides for ritual practice is to overturn our assumptions completely. It is also to confront the eerie possibility that our own boundaries between sacred and profane are arbitrary, fragile, and recent. The question then arises, why did history try so diligently to erase these truths? The answer lies partly in fear. To acknowledge the sanctity of desire is to admit that authority rests not in law alone but in the body, in experiences that cannot be controlled by decree. Pleasure is unruly, unpredictable, resistant to regulation. And yet, if sanctified, it becomes the ultimate source of power. Later conquerors, Roman governors, Christian bishops, Muslim jurists, sought to suppress this because they understood its threat. To leave such rituals intact was to risk rebellion, for the people might learn to look not to priests or rulers but to their own bodies as gateways to divinity. And so the chisels fell, the papyri burned, the songs silenced. What remained was a sanitized Egypt, grand in architecture but stripped of its most dangerous pulse. Yet even in their erasure, the echoes persist. At Dendera, in Hathor's temple, one can still see reliefs of musicians whose instruments suggest rhythms of ecstasy. At Abydos, the Osirian mysteries whisper of couplings meant to bring gods back from death. At Luxor, the great axis of the temple still aligns with the heavens, a cosmic spine that once guided processions of flesh and song. And in the papyri locked in museum drawers, images of desire stare back at us with unashamed boldness, daring us to see them not as obscenity but as memory. To stand before these remnants is to feel a strange unease. It is not simply curiosity, nor scandal, but something deeper, the recognition that what we have been taught to separate was once united. The Egyptians did not divide holiness from sexuality, nor spirit from flesh. They embraced them as one, weaving desire into prayer, ecstasy into worship, intimacy into governance. And though we may resist, a part of us longs to remember. We are left with a vision both haunting and alluring. In the hidden chambers of Egypt's temples, sexuality was not hidden in shame but revealed in glory. It was the engine of ritual, the heart of kingship, the bridge between earth and sky. And though history has tried to hide this, the truth persists in fragments, like embers refusing to die. To listen to these whispers is to confront not only the past but ourselves, to ask whether the boundaries we cling to are eternal or illusions. In the end, the erotic secrets of the pharaohs remind us that the body itself was once scripture, and that desire, far from being suppressed, was once the holiest prayer of all. Beneath the gilded mask of dynastic power, where the Nile reflected the endless heavens and temples stretched toward eternity, there lay a truth too dangerous to be carved in stone and too intoxicating to be entirely erased. This was the truth of how eroticism intertwined with dominion, how passion became a form of politics, and how secret rites of desire were conducted not simply in chambers of luxury but within sanctuaries guarded by silence and shadows. To explore these hidden practices is to step into a chamber where history quivers, half ashamed, half enraptured, unable to decide whether to veil the story or allow its echoes to emerge from the darkness. The serpent and the scepter, symbols of both life and rule, were not simply ornamental, they carried with them meanings that rippled into the domain of sexuality, fertility, and authority, a triad that bound pharaohs to their gods and their people alike. The serpent in Egyptian lore slithered between threat and salvation. It was the uraeus, the cobra that adorned the brow of kings, poised to spit fire at enemies, yet it was also the creature of the earth, winding through the loam, fertile and dangerous, fertile because it was dangerous. The scepter, held firmly in the hand of the ruler, was the staff of command, a phallic extension of dominion, pointed toward the heavens, grounded in the soil. Together these symbols murmured of a deeper unity, that rulership itself was a form of seduction, and that the pharaoh's command over his people was mirrored in his command over the body, his own and others. What is concealed in the records is not merely ritual or ceremony but an understanding that desire itself was a source of power, one which could topple dynasties if misused, or eternalize them if mastered. Priests who whispered in the incense-laden darkness of Karnak spoke of power in ways that slipped beyond the language of governance. They spoke of magnetism, of the unseen currents that moved between two bodies in union. For them, eroticism was not a distraction from kingship, it was its root, the place where vigor, fertility, and charisma converged. A pharaoh who could not command desire, whether his own or that of those around him, risked appearing weak before the gods, who themselves embodied the ceaseless cycle of creation and copulation. Myths did not shy away from such imagery. Ra birthed himself from the watery abyss, Adam brought forth creation from his own act of self-pleasure, and Isis wove her cunning with spells of seduction to resurrect Osiris. To the people of the Nile, these stories were not obscene but sacred, they whispered of a truth the modern world has forgotten, that creation itself begins in an act of longing, that power flows through pleasure as surely as the floodwaters rejuvenated the land. Yet, because such knowledge was dangerous, it was carefully controlled. Hieroglyphs alluded to it obliquely, carvings suggested more than they revealed, and texts that spoke too directly were often hidden away, copied only for the eyes of priests or burned in waves of puritanical conquest. Even the Greeks, when they encountered these traditions, struggled to put into words what they had seen. Herodotus, peering into Egypt with the eyes of a foreigner, hinted at strange rites, at mysteries bound up in the mating of humans and gods, at festivals where fertility was celebrated with a frankness that scandalized later ages. His words became the faint smoke left after the flame, a residue that told us something more had burned brightly before. One cannot walk through the temple of Luxor or gaze upon the reliefs of Dendra without sensing that more lies beneath the surface of the carvings. Figures that appear simply to carry offerings are drawn with curves too deliberate, postures too suggestive. The gods themselves are not merely enthroned but seated in gestures of potency, their regalia unmistakably coated with erotic symbolism. To the Egyptian eye, this was not vulgarity but the very fabric of reality. The pharaoh's scepter was both weapon and phallus, protector and penetrator, an emblem of his sacred virility. Without virility there could be no order, no ma'at, no balance of cosmos and earth. Thus, the erotic was not hidden because it was obscene, it was hidden because it was dangerous, a fire that could blind as easily as it illuminated. The serpent, too, took on forms that blurred lines of desire and fear. Wadjet, the cobra goddess, could be a protective mother and deadly seductress, her coils suffocating enemies yet encircling the pharaoh with heat and power. In ritual texts, serpentine imagery appears when speaking of kundalini-like energy rising through the spine, though the Egyptians did not use that term. They spoke instead of life force, sekam, the current that ascends like a snake within the body, igniting visions, arousal, power. Priests were trained to awaken it, often through rites that to outsiders would seem scandalous, rites of touch, of breath, of union. For them, these were not indulgences but paths to higher command, channels through which divine energy could flood the vessel of the ruler. Consider the story of Hathor, goddess of love and intoxication, who once was sent to pacify Ra's wrath. She did so not through argument or battle but through dance, through sensual display, through erotic charm. Her power lay not in weaponry but in allure. When she swayed, when she revealed herself, even gods relented. This tale, preserved in fragments, tells us something profound, that erotic power was acknowledged as a force capable of shaping destiny, even divine destiny. Pharaohs understood this, and so they adorned themselves not only in gold but in scent, in gesture, in ceremony meant to inflame the senses. Their rule was not over the body politic alone, but over the deep desires woven into the people's collective soul. It is no wonder then that later ages sought to obscure these truths. When Christianity spread through Egypt, the frankness of erotic theology became an embarrassment, a rival narrative that had to be suppressed. Scrolls were burned, reliefs defaced, festivals transformed into harmless parades stripped of their former intensity. What had once been divine became rebranded as obscene. But the memory lingered in secret, surviving in coded phrases, in rural fertility rituals, in tales told in whispers under the moonlight by farmers who still felt the Nile's pulse as a lover's touch. If one peers closely, the very architecture of Egyptian temples suggests these hidden meanings. The inner sanctum, the most sacred chamber, often narrow and dark, can be read as a symbolic womb, into which only the initiated entered, bearing offerings that were not merely material but erotic in implication. The long corridors leading inward resembled a journey into the body, the transition from light to darkness and finally into rebirth. Pilgrims may not have seen it so, but priests and pharaohs did, for they understood that to command a people one must also command the subconscious, the realm where sexuality reigns supreme. To step into the temple was to step into the body of creation itself, to remember that rulership was founded not only in decree but in desire. The erotic secrets of the pharaohs, then, were less about scandalous tales of indulgence and more about a philosophy of power. They saw that the forces which ignite passion in the body are the same forces that ignite passion in the world. To command them was to stand at the very heart of creation. But to reveal them openly would be to risk chaos, for what would happen if every subject sought to wield the same seductive power as their king? Thus, the secrets were wrapped in symbols, hidden in myth, allowed only in controlled bursts during festivals and rites. The serpent and the scepter remained, their meanings opaque to most, yet their presence undeniable. And so, as we drift deeper into this labyrinth of desire and dominion, we begin to understand why history has so often chosen silence. Not because the past was prudish, but because it feared the potency of these truths. Knowledge of how to weave sexuality into power is knowledge that unsettles rulers, for it suggests that authority is not maintained merely by law or force but by the invisible tether of desire. In this realization lies the key to the forbidden chamber of Egyptian history, where the serpent coils, the scepter gleams, and the shadows whisper of pleasures that shaped empires. The secrets that slumbered within the serpent and the scepter were never meant for common eyes, for they spoke of dominion not only over lands and armies but over the invisible domains of body and spirit. As we unveil how erotic energy was cultivated and symbolized, this half turns to the more dangerous terrain, how such energy was wielded, how it was abused, and how its memory threatened those who sought to rewrite Egypt into something tamer, cleaner, less frightening to their own worldviews. If the serpent whispered of awakening and the scepter glistened with authority, together they formed a dangerous code, an understanding that power itself is erotic, and that to suppress the erotic is to weaken the very foundation upon which empires rise. One cannot ignore the whispers that surrounded certain dynasties, whispers preserved in fragments, papyri torn and scorched, or graffiti scrawled upon hidden walls. Some spoke of ceremonies held under veiled moonlight, where the pharaoh would enact the role of Osiris reborn and his queen that of Isis resurrecting her husband through union. These were not metaphorical plays but physical rites, intended to renew the vitality of the king and, by extension, the land. The serpent's energy, aroused and guided, was said to climb the spine, erupting into visions that granted the ruler foresight. The scepter, meanwhile, was plunged into soil, into sacred water, into the air itself, each act charged with phallic symbolism. Here, politics dissolved into performance, and performance became sacred duty. Such practices were not confined to private chambers. Festivals of fertility, long sanitized in later retellings, were once far less restrained. During the Festival of Min, for example, reliefs depict the pharaoh raising a massive erect phallus of the fertility god, an image too blatant for most modern textbooks but preserved nonetheless on temple walls. Priests and participants would join in ecstatic processions, waving sheaves of lettuce, plants believed to stimulate virility, and chanting hymns that blended prayer with innuendo. To the Egyptian mind, this was not shameful, it was the affirmation of life's power coursing through their ruler. The serpent and the scepter were alive in such rituals, their symbolism no longer hidden but paraded before thousands, a living reminder that kingship was as much about fecundity as it was about war or law. What unsettles us now is not that such ceremonies occurred, but that they were integrated seamlessly into the machinery of statecraft. A ruler's ability to rule was judged, in part, on his virility, his capacity to generate life, to attract desire, to channel the energies of creation. A barren pharaoh was a weak pharaoh, one whose reign would be questioned, whose legitimacy might collapse. Thus, the erotic became political, and the political became erotic. It was not simply that the serpent and the scepter represented these truths, they were the truths, embodied in symbols, carved into stone, immortalized in myth. The priests, those ever-watchful stewards of power, were not immune to such secrets. They developed techniques, breathwork, chants, touch, that could intensify the energies within the body, awaken hidden currents, and direct them toward visions or manifestations. Some texts hint at hieroglyphs so explicit in their guidance that later scribes felt compelled to erase or obscure them, leaving scholars puzzled by odd gaps and fractured sentences. The knowledge was too potent, too volatile, for it suggested that ordinary men and women, if initiated, might wield the same force that the pharaoh claimed as his divine birthright. To control this danger, secrecy became essential. Only those chosen, those bound by oaths, were permitted to glimpse the full rites. Yet secrecy breeds allure, and allure breeds transgression. There are faint echoes of scandals, concubines who learned too much, priests who attempted to channel power for themselves, queens whose mastery of desire eclipsed that of their husbands. Cleopatra, though far removed in time from the early dynasties, inherited this tradition. Roman writers, scandalized by her allure, depicted her not merely as a ruler but as an enchantress whose sexuality was indistinguishable from her politics. Though they vilified her, they also betrayed their own recognition of an ancient Egyptian truth, that eros and authority are inseparable, that to deny this is to blind oneself to half the story of power. Consider also the serpent in its more terrifying aspect. The Ouroboros, the serpent devouring its own tail, spoke of cycles eternal, but also of the self-consuming nature of desire. Pharaohs who overindulged, who allowed the serpent's fire to consume them, were often remembered with shame, their reigns depicted as decadent, their kingdoms weakened. The same energy that could elevate is also destroyed, for erotic power is never neutral, it magnifies, amplifies, intoxicates. Thus, the scepter, symbol of control, was necessary to balance the serpent's wildness. Without the discipline of the scepter, the serpent descended into chaos. Without the serpent, the scepter was sterile, lifeless, impotent. The dance between them was fragile, and history records both its triumphs and its collapses. When the Greeks and later the Romans absorbed fragments of this knowledge, they reinterpreted it through their own frameworks. Dionysian rituals, with their frenzy and ecstasy, echo the Egyptian festivals, though stripped of their political integration. Mystery cults hinted at secret unions between initiates and gods, yet these were always tinged with Egyptian flavor, as if the memory of the Nile's dangerous truths could not entirely be forgotten. Still, with each retelling, the sharper edges dulled, the explicit faded into allegory, until only faint shadows remained. The serpent and the scepter became abstractions, their erotic potency buried beneath centuries of moralizing. It is easy to imagine the Christian monks, entering abandoned temples, chipping away at images of phalluses, serpents, and entwined deities. To them, these were not sacred but obscene, dangerous relics of a pagan past that had to be purged. Scrolls were burned, reliefs plastered over, festivals outlawed. Yet erasure is never complete. In the dust of manuscripts, in the overlooked carvings of temple corners, in the strange stories preserved in Coptic folklore, the traces survive. They whisper to us still, suggesting that the pharaohs possessed knowledge of a force the modern world still struggles to name, a force that flows through desire, that binds creation to destruction, that makes rulers of men and gods alike. What, then, are we to make of these secrets, uncovered in fragments, glimpsed in shadows? Perhaps the lesson is not merely historical but universal. Power and desire are inseparable, to pretend otherwise is to lie to ourselves. The pharaohs knew this and crafted a world where their authority was continually renewed through erotic performance, where their very bodies became theaters of cosmic drama. They were not embarrassed by this truth, they wielded it, flaunted it, sanctified it. History, in its prudishness, has attempted to bury it. But the serpent slithers on, the scepter gleams still, and the echoes of those forbidden rites call to us from beneath the sands. To listen to them is to feel both awe and unease, for the knowledge is unsettling. It reminds us that beneath every empire lies not only law and order but passion and desire, that no crown can sit securely without mastery of the unseen currents that bind ruler to rule. The erotic secrets of the pharaohs were not trivial, they were foundational, pillars upon which the might of Egypt stood. They were hidden not because they were irrelevant, but because they were too relevant, too enduring, too capable of shaking the illusions of those who came after. And so, we stand at the threshold of understanding, gazing into the forbidden chamber where the serpent coils, the scepter rests, and the truth of power lies exposed, shimmering in the half-light, eternal, and impossible to silence. To the ancient Egyptians, death was not an ending but a crossing, a passage through veils that shimmered like the heat haze above the desert. They believed life was a cycle, an unbroken river flowing between earth and sky, body and spirit, desire and dissolution. What is less often told, however, is that this belief did not exclude the erotic. On the contrary, desire seeped into their visions of the afterlife, threading itself through myths, funerary texts, and the whispered hopes of those who built tombs meant to last for eternity. It is here, in the dim light of the mortuary chamber, that we discover a truth too unsettling for later scribes to accept: the erotic was not left behind in life. It followed the soul into death, shaping the journey through the underworld, guiding reunions with lovers long lost, and ensuring that even in eternity, the body did not forget the language of longing. Consider the tomb of Nefertari, wife of Ramses II, whose walls shimmer with colors so vivid they appear newly painted. Here we find not only images of gods and protective spells but scenes where the queen stands radiant, her body draped in transparent linen, her gaze locked with Osiris, lord of the afterlife. Their meeting is no sterile ritual. It is charged, intimate, suggestive of a reunion that transcends mortality. To the Egyptians, such depictions were not scandalous but essential. For what would paradise mean if not the continuation of love, of touch, of embrace? The afterlife promised gardens, music, feasts, but it also promised desire, a realm where lovers could reunite, where fertility was eternal, where the generative forces of the cosmos pulsed without end. The Book of the Dead, that sprawling collection of spells meant to guide the soul through perilous passage, contains fragments that hint at this. While most translations emphasize judgment, balance, and the weighing of the heart, less attention is paid to verses where the deceased prays for vitality in all limbs, for virility restored, for the ability to embrace once more. Even in eternity, the pharaoh desired his potency, not only to father dynasties on earth but to join eternally with the goddess who awaited him in the fields of reeds. The serpent and the scepter followed him into death, coiled in his grave goods, etched upon the walls, whispered into the incantations. These were not relics of power only for life, they were tools for the journey beyond, talismans of an erotic eternity. It is said that Isis, in resurrecting Osiris, conceived Horus not through ordinary union but through magic entwined with desire. She shaped his fragmented body, reassembled it, and through her longing breathed life into him once more. This myth is central not only to kingship but to Egyptian visions of the afterlife. Resurrection itself was imagined as an erotic act, a reawakening not just of breath but of passion. To die was to be fragmented, to lose coherence. To rise again was to be made whole, and wholeness was inseparable from desire. Erotic longing was the glue that bound pieces of the soul together. Without it, the spirit risked disintegration, eternal wandering. With it, the soul could rejoin the cycle, vibrant, fertile, whole. Tombs themselves often reflected this longing. Carvings show husbands and wives embracing, holding hands, sometimes depicted in intimate postures that scholars long dismissed as affectionate gestures. Yet to dismiss them as mere sentimentality is to overlook the deeper truth. They are erotic affirmations, promises that in the next world the body will remember, that the warmth of skin against skin will not be forgotten. For the Egyptians, love was not transient but cosmic, a force strong enough to transcend even death. If we look carefully, the erotic becomes visible even in the most solemn funerary art, a quiet rebellion against the silence of the grave. One cannot forget the rituals of embalming, where priests, in hushed tones, enacted symbolic unions upon the body. There are records suggesting that in some instances, the embalmers, acting as surrogates of Horus, would perform rites that symbolized the deceased being revived through sexual energy. These details, though seldom emphasized, point toward a worldview where the erotic was inseparable from rebirth. Death was not sterile, it was fertile, an interval where the body was prepared not only to endure eternity but to desire within it. Later traditions found this disturbing, too corporeal, too sensual for comfort, and so such rites were recast as mere symbolic gestures, their deeper meanings sealed behind euphemism. In the Valley of the Kings, where silence lingers and the desert sun scorches the cliffs, the tombs of pharaohs whisper of this continuity. Hieroglyphs speak of pleasures restored, of joy without end. Some texts even promise that the deceased shall eat, drink, and make love as on earth, but forever, without exhaustion or decline. The erotic, in this vision, was eternalized, not fleeting but perfected. For what greater paradise could there be than a love unending, desire unquenched, renewal without decay? The Egyptians dared to imagine such a state, and in their boldness they terrified later ages, which could not reconcile holiness with sensuality, nor eternity with the body's longing. Festivals of the dead, too, carried erotic undertones. Families visiting tombs would leave not only bread and beer but perfumes, oils, and cosmetics, gifts of beauty, of allure, reminders that their loved ones continued to be beings of desire even in the beyond. To give scent was to awaken memory, to give kohl was to honor the gaze of the eyes, even in eternity. This continuity unsettles modern minds, accustomed to separating the sacred from the sensual. But to the Egyptians, there was no such division. The body was sacred precisely because it was sensual, and desire was not an obstacle to eternity but its very guarantee. It is telling that when later conquerors entered these tombs, they often found the erotic elements most disturbing. Greek and Roman writers, while fascinated by Egypt's grandeur, struggled with its frank acceptance of Eros in death. For them, the afterlife was shadowy, muted, stripped of passion. To encounter a culture that imagined death as an erotic continuation was bewildering, even offensive. Christian chroniclers, centuries later, were harsher still, branding such depictions as obscene, evidence of Egypt's corruption. Yet their attempts at suppression only confirm the potency of what they sought to erase. For if the erotic were trivial, why would they fear it so? As we sink deeper into this meditation, one cannot help but reflect upon the paradox of history. What Egypt celebrated openly, later ages could not even whisper without shame. What Egyptians carved into stone, Christians sought to destroy, Muslims to reinterpret, Victorians to bury in footnotes. And yet the erotic refuses silence. It rises from the tomb walls, glimmers in the eyes of painted queens, coils in the serpentine hieroglyphs that no censorship could fully erase. It is as though Egypt itself knew that the only eternity worth longing for was one where desire remained alive, forever entwined with the soul. To step into the afterlife chambers, then, is to feel a strange intimacy. One is surrounded not only by gods and spells but by the echoes of lovers, by promises of touch, by the sighs of souls who refuse to surrender their longing even to death. The veils of the afterlife shimmer with mystery, but also with an unmistakable sensuality, reminding us that the erotic was never meant to be exiled from eternity. It was meant to guide it, to sustain it, to remind the soul that it is never complete without desire. And as the incense burns low, as our footsteps echo softly against stone, we realize that the Egyptians left us a gift, one unsettling, one irresistible, the vision of a paradise where love and passion endure, forever and always. The veil of night descended once more upon the realm of shadows, but in this place the distinction between night and day was a fragile illusion, for time did not flow as it did in the waking world. The lovers who had crossed the boundaries of flesh and mortality now wandered deeper into the labyrinth of the afterlife, hand in hand, their steps light yet heavy with the knowledge that each new turn in this ethereal journey brought them closer to truths neither had dared to imagine in life. Around them, the air shimmered as though woven from fragments of forgotten prayers, and in the distance voices rose and fell like waves, sometimes tender, sometimes mournful, as if the entire cosmos whispered fragments of every love ever lived, lost, or remembered. The afterlife was not silence but symphony, and within its haunting music the lovers felt themselves at once insignificant and eternal. They passed beneath archways fashioned from memory itself, luminous gates sculpted by the longing of souls who had gone before. Each arch seemed to open into a different landscape, fields of golden wheat that rippled without wind, oceans without tides reflecting skies of endless dawn, forests where the trees whispered the names of those left behind. At times they paused, touching these thresholds, sensing how they resonated with the essence of human yearning. One gate pulled them toward the vision of a cottage by a river, a place they had once dreamed of building in life, where children would laugh in the garden and the seasons would pass in quiet joy. Yet when they reached out, the vision dissolved into mist, leaving behind only the ache of possibility. This was the cruelty of the afterlife's architecture. It granted glimpses of what could have been, but never allowed one to remain within them. The woman turned to her beloved and asked in a voice soft as candle flame, "Are these places punishments, or gifts? Are we meant to suffer from what we see, or to be comforted by what might have been?" Her question lingered, and though the man did not answer at once, his silence was not emptiness but contemplation. He knew the answer might be both, that the afterlife was neither torment nor solace, but reflection, a mirror held up to the soul until it could no longer deny itself. Perhaps the veil they walked beneath was not placed by any divine hand but by the threads of their own mortal hearts. As they pressed forward, the veil itself began to thin, as if their persistence, their refusal to part even in death, was unraveling the very boundaries of this place. Shadows brightened, and in their light forms began to emerge, other souls, other wanderers adrift in the endless passageways. Some clutched tokens from life, faded letters, children's toys, fragments of jewelry, each holding them close as if the objects were lifelines keeping them from dissolution. Others moved with empty eyes, already half forgotten, fading into the very mist they walked upon. The lovers watched with mingled awe and dread, realizing that love was the tether that bound one to being, and without it the self dissolved into formlessness. Here in the afterlife, memory was matter, and longing was substance. They came at last to a great hall, vast as a cathedral, its ceiling obscured by swirls of smoke and light. At its center stood a river, not water, but liquid starlight, flowing without source or mouth, its current both still and swift. Souls gathered along its banks, some kneeling to drink from its glow, others staring into its depths as though it reflected every moment of their existence. The lovers, too, approached, and when they peered into the radiant current they did not see their faces but the threads of their shared life. Every glance, every word, every tear and every smile woven together into a single luminous fabric. The river was memory itself, and it offered neither judgment nor absolution, only truth. The woman gasped as she saw herself as a child, running through sunlit fields, long before she had known her beloved. She saw her parents' weary smiles, the small tragedies of youth, the long nights of loneliness that had preceded the spark of their love. Then the man appeared, not as he had been when they first met, but as he had been long before, a boy dreaming by the fire, longing for someone whose face he did not yet know. The river revealed that they had been moving toward one another their entire lives, threads drawn by an invisible loom. Tears blurred her vision, for in that luminous tapestry she understood that their love was not an accident but a destiny, a convergence written across the span of their existence. Yet as they gazed deeper, the river revealed not only what was but what might yet come. They saw a path where one of them had lived longer, mourning the other across years of aching solitude. They saw a path where they had never met at all, each walking alone until their final breath. And still another, where their union had borne children who carried their laughter into the next generation. The multitude of possibilities was dizzying, overwhelming, and the lovers clung to one another as the flood of visions threatened to sweep them apart. It was then that a voice rose from the river, not spoken but intoned within their very hearts. Love is eternal, yet love is fragile. What you see are not certainties but echoes, for every soul carries countless veils. You may choose to remain bound here, wandering in memory, or you may pass beyond, into silence, where even love dissolves into unity. The choice is yours, and yours alone. The lovers trembled, for the weight of choice was heavier than chains. To remain meant to hold on to one another, but at the risk of being trapped forever in a cycle of yearning and remembrance. To pass beyond meant to dissolve the very bond that had carried them through death, to surrender individuality into some greater expanse where you and I no longer existed. The woman pressed her forehead to her beloved's chest, and in the silence she whispered, "I fear nothing but losing you." Her words, simple as they were, became an anchor in the shifting tides of eternity. Together they turned from the river, for they were not ready to surrender. Their love, imperfect though it had been in life, was the one truth they could not abandon, the one light that held back the abyss. The river's glow dimmed behind them, and the hall gave way to another path, narrower and darker, winding downward as though into the very roots of existence. Here the air grew heavy, and the mist clung like a shroud, but their joined hands remained warm, and that warmth was enough to sustain them. As they descended, they began to hear faint murmurs, not the symphonic chorus of the earlier halls, but intimate voices, fragments of confessions, whispered regrets, words never spoken in life. They realized with unease that these were the unspoken truths of countless souls, drifting in the depths like lost prayers. A mother apologizing to a child she had left behind, a lover confessing betrayal, a friend admitting jealousy never voiced. The lovers heard these voices as though they brushed against their own skin, and in that cacophony they felt the rawness of the human heart laid bare. This was no punishment but a stripping away of illusion, for to love beyond death was to walk not only in memory but in naked honesty. The man faltered, for among the voices he thought he heard his own, confessing fears he had never spoken, doubts he had buried deep. He remembered moments of weakness, times he had questioned whether he was worthy of her love, nights when he had feared he might lose her. The shame of those memories pressed upon him like stone, but the woman lifted his chin, meeting his gaze without reproach. "We are not perfect," she said, "but we are together. That is enough." In her eyes he saw no judgment, only the reflection of his own humanity embraced, and in that embrace the weight lifted, if only slightly. Their path narrowed until at last they emerged into a chamber unlike any before. At its center stood a single tree, vast and luminous, its branches spreading outward to pierce the very fabric of the veil. Its roots plunged into the unseen depths, while its leaves shimmered with light drawn from every soul that had ever loved. The lovers approached, and the tree stirred as though alive, its leaves whispering in 1,000 voices. Here, at last, was the heart of the afterlife, the axis upon which all veils turned. They understood without being told that they could rest beneath this tree for eternity, or ascend through its branches into the unknown beyond. The woman touched the bark, and warmth spread through her palm, filling her with a serenity she had not known since childhood. The man, too, laid his hand upon the trunk, and together they felt the pulse of countless lovers who had come before them, who had chosen to cling, to let go, to wander, to rest. Every story was preserved here, not as memory but as essence, woven into the living wood. They realized that even should they one day dissolve into the great silence, their love would remain etched into this eternal tree, a thread among infinite threads, unbroken by death or time. At last they sat beneath its branches, leaning into one another as though they had never died, and the veil above parted to reveal not sky but infinity, a horizon without end. They did not know what would come next, whether they would remain here, whether they would climb, whether they would one day surrender even this bond. But in that moment, they were unafraid, for love had carried them farther than life itself, and whatever lay beyond would be faced together. The afterlife had tested them, shown them visions of loss and temptation, but still they endured, hand in hand, hearts intertwined. And so the veils of the afterlife shimmered once more, shifting like curtains drawn aside for the next act of eternity. The lovers, though two among countless souls, had carved their path through shadow and memory, their bond a beacon that whispered to every wandering spirit, love does not end with death, but continues, fragile and fierce, as long as two hearts refuse to let go. The desert does not forget. Long after dynasties crumble and empires vanish into dust, the sands hold their secrets, waiting in silence for the moment when the wind will shift, when the dunes will peel back, when the hidden will emerge once more. Egypt is a land of graves, yet its graves are not quiet. They murmur, they pulse, they breathe with fragments of memory that no conqueror has ever managed to erase. Walk long enough beneath the stars, and you may feel it, the faint tremor beneath your feet, as though the very ground remembers what it has buried. And what it has buried, most of all, are truths too unsettling for history to embrace. The erotic, in Egypt, was not an indulgence, nor a secret vice. It was a cosmology, a force as essential as the Nile itself, winding through myth, ritual, kingship, and eternity. We have walked through tombs painted with embraces, read prayers that begged not only for life but for vitality, uncovered amulets that carried not only protection but potency. And yet, for centuries, these truths have been deliberately obscured. Priests reinterpreted them, conquerors defaced them, chroniclers dismissed them as vulgar superstition. Why? Because desire unsettles. Because desire resists control. Because desire, when woven into eternity, dares to claim that the sacred and the sensual are not opposites but mirrors of one another. History, at its surface, has told us of Egypt's power, its pyramids, its armies, its gold. But beneath the stone lies another story, softer yet sharper, one that reveals why so many feared to tell it. For the erotic secrets of the pharaohs were not secrets of indulgence, but of vision. They dared to imagine a universe where the body's longings were not distractions from holiness but gateways into it. They dared to believe that love could survive the grave, that desire itself could shape eternity. And for this, their truths were buried, first beneath layers of euphemism, then beneath the heavy silence of disapproval. Yet the silence has never been complete. Every now and then, a crack appears. An inscription discovered, a mural cleaned of soot, a papyrus fragment translated with new eyes. Each fragment whispers against the weight of centuries, "Do not forget. Do not erase. We were not ashamed." And in these whispers, one feels the uncanny pulse of a truth older than time, that love and longing are not fleeting flames but eternal currents, deeper than stone, stronger than empire. Stand before the ruins of Thebes, or wander into the chambers of Luxor, and you will feel it, the lingering presence of eyes that once gazed with longing, hands that once reached across distance, lips that once spoke words too tender to record. These ruins are not cold. They radiate, even now, with an energy that unsettles the scholar and seduces the wanderer. It is the energy of a civilization that knew desire was not to be hidden but celebrated, not to be exiled but eternalized. And it is this energy that later centuries, trembling in fear of its implications, tried so hard to bury. For to accept Egypt's truth would be to accept that the human body, its passions, its weaknesses, its pleasures, is not a cage but a temple. To accept Egypt's truth would be to recognize that the afterlife itself might be a realm not of disembodied spirits but of reunited lovers, of eternal embraces, of longing that does not end with the breath. Such ideas threatened the rigid boundaries of later faiths, where salvation required denial, where purity was imagined as absence. Egypt dared to suggest otherwise, that purity might be found not in abstinence but in wholeness, in the unbroken union of body and spirit, love and eternity. As the night deepens and the stars draw their silent arcs across the sky, one feels the immensity of what was nearly lost. Imagine if the erotic secrets of the pharaohs had not been suppressed but celebrated. Imagine if their vision of desire as sacred had shaped not only their world but ours. Would we still whisper love as though it were fragile, still hide passion as though it were shameful? Or would we stand, as they once stood, unafraid to carve our longing into stone, to let it live forever in the halls of eternity? And yet, Perhaps the suppression itself is part of the secret's power. For what is hidden becomes more alluring, what is buried becomes more potent. Egypt's erotic truths, veiled and denied, linger like shadows in the corner of the historian's study, like echoes in the traveler's dream. They resist complete translation. They demand more than study, they demand surrender. To encounter them is not simply to learn but to feel, to let the silence of the desert seep into the bones until one understands, with a clarity both eerie and calming, that desire is eternal. The sands shift again. The dunes rise and fall like the breath of a sleeping god. Somewhere beneath them lies another tomb, another chamber painted with scenes the world is not ready to see. Perhaps tomorrow it will be uncovered. Perhaps another century will pass before the wind yields it up. But whether seen or unseen, remembered or forgotten, the truth remains. Egypt has not finished whispering. It never will. And as we step back from these shadows, as the flicker of torchlight fades and the vast silence of the desert enfolds us, we realize that what unsettles us most is not Egypt's strangeness but its intimacy. For in the end, these secrets are not theirs alone. They are ours. They remind us that to live is to desire, to die is to desire still, and to love is to carve eternity into the fragile span of a single human life. The erotic secrets of the pharaohs endure not because they are foreign, but because they are familiar, because deep within us we know that desire is the one language the grave cannot silence. To end with silence is impossible, for the whispers of the pharaohs continue to drift across time, faint yet persistent, like incense burned in forgotten sanctuaries. The erotic secrets of ancient Egypt, long hidden, often deliberately erased, sometimes distorted by the lenses of later moralities, stand before us as more than curiosities of the past. They are fragments of a mirror, reflecting not only the private world of the ancients but also the anxieties of every era that followed, each one deciding which truths could be seen and which must be buried beneath layers of propriety and myth. What we inherit, then, is not just the memory of Egypt but the record of how memory itself has been disciplined, censored, and reimagined. The pharaohs, those rulers elevated to the status of living gods, presided over a culture that embraced the body not as something shameful, but as a vessel of cosmic power. Their myths were soaked in sensuality, their temples carved with symbols of fertility, their rituals entwined with acts meant to echo creation itself. To them, sexuality was not hidden in shadows, it was a force as sacred as the Nile's flood, sustaining life, renewing order, binding human and divine. Yet later chroniclers, from early Christian scribes to Victorian historians, recoiled from this vision, dismissing it as decadence, erasing it as heresy, rewriting it as sin. In their silence, a distortion was born, that the Egypt we should remember was solemn, monumental, austere. But beneath the stone gaze of the Sphinx lies another truth, one that pulses with desire. Why, then, was this truth so threatening? Perhaps because it undermined the narratives that subsequent civilizations needed to tell themselves. To imagine that the builders of pyramids and guardians of eternity were also lovers of erotic play, celebrants of pleasure, experimenters in passion, complicated the ideal of Egypt as merely a tomb-bound civilization obsessed with death. It also complicated the authority of later religions that sought to impose stricter codes of sexual morality. What was easier, to admit that the ancients celebrated sex as sacred, or to reduce them to relics who, for all their splendor, lacked the moral clarity of those who came after? Thus the erotic became not only hidden, but actively buried, interred under centuries of scholarly decorum. Yet fragments remained, like shards of pottery that refused to crumble. The erotic poems scratched onto papyri, the fertility figurines tucked into tombs, the ritual instructions describing acts of renewal between priest and priestess, all testify that this dimension of Egypt never vanished. It was only hidden in plain sight, awaiting rediscovery by those daring enough to read without moral blinders. Each generation of Egyptologists confronted these fragments, and many chose silence, not out of ignorance, but out of fear that the erotic truths would taint the grand image of Egypt as the cradle of civilization, fear that the public would recoil, fear that to admit the ancients embraced sexuality openly was to challenge modern taboos. But in silencing the erotic, something essential is lost. To deny the sexual dimension of the pharaohs is to flatten their humanity, to turn them into stone effigies stripped of flesh. It is to imagine that the builders of Karnak were immune to longing, that the scribes who penned hymns to the gods never penned verses of desire, that queens and concubines alike moved through palace corridors untouched by passion. In truth, to restore their erotic secrets is to restore their humanity in full, to see them not only as rulers and architects but as lovers, partners, beings of blood and breath. What lessons linger, then, in these buried truths? Perhaps the most unsettling is that our discomfort says as much about us as it does about them. The impulse to hide the erotic secrets of Egypt did not come from the ancients, it came from later centuries that struggled with their own relationship to the body. We look back and imagine them as primitive, yet in some ways they were freer, more integrated, less divided against themselves. To them, desire was not shame but strength, not temptation but continuity with the divine. Their myths of Isis and Osiris, where resurrection was bound to erotic union, remind us that creation itself was seen as inseparable from passion. That the universe was not born from abstinence, but from embrace. There is, of course, danger in romanticizing this freedom. To speak of Egypt's erotic culture is not to imagine some utopia without boundaries, but to recognize that their relationship to sexuality was complex, layered with ritual, power, hierarchy, and myth. The pharaoh's own sexuality was often politicized, his fertility bound to the fertility of the land. Concubines were not merely lovers but symbols of alliances, instruments of dynastic survival. Erotic practices were sometimes celebratory, sometimes coercive, sometimes deeply symbolic. To approach them with honesty is to recognize both their liberating and troubling dimensions, refusing both prudish denial and naive idealization. And yet, perhaps it is precisely this complexity that history tried to hide. For to acknowledge it requires us to confront the contradictions in our own time, how we speak of liberation while censoring desire, how we market sexuality as commodity while suppressing it as shame, how we wrestle with the same tensions that rippled through temples along the Nile thousands of years ago. The erotic secrets of the pharaohs remind us that the past is never as distant as it seems. Their silenced whispers echo in our own debates, our own anxieties, our own attempts to reconcile body and spirit, desire and morality, freedom and control. As the sands shift and the temples crumble, we are left with fragments, yet fragments are enough. Enough to remind us that beneath the hieroglyphs of kings and the grandeur of monuments lies a culture that dared to embrace the totality of human experience. Enough to show us that history, when censored, becomes not truth but illusion. Enough to call us into the unsettling silence where hidden truths wait to be seen. So we close, not with scandal but with reflection. The erotic secrets of the pharaohs are not meant to titillate, but to awaken us to the fullness of human history, to the ways in which desire and divinity, power and passion, flesh and eternity have always been intertwined. What we choose to hide says as much about our fears as it does about the past itself. What we choose to reveal can either liberate or condemn us. In the end, the sands of Egypt bury everything, yet they also preserve. The papyri crumble, but the whispers remain. The statues erode, but the meanings endure. The erotic, though long hidden, continues to pulse beneath the stones, a reminder that history is not only what we write, it is what we dare to remember. And if we listen closely, in the silence of tombs or the shadows of temples, we may yet hear the echo of laughter, the sigh of desire, the heartbeat of lovers whose secrets, though long denied, still linger in the eternal night. The question that remains, then, is not why history tried to hide them, but whether we are ready to see.